By the ancestors, is this strange contraption truly transmitting? If you are receiving this, consider yourselves privileged, or perhaps cursed, to witness the final, agonizing breaths of true warrior spirit. You are tuned into the Edo Echoes, broadcasting live, or more accurately, dying gracefully live, from the year of our Lord 186X, somewhere in a very, very confused Japan. My name is Master Kenji Humble Samurai, and if the possible audacity of this trans-dimensional broadcast from a time when honor clashes with cannon smoke doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to understanding true virtue, then perhaps your soul is already lost to the Western barbarians. Do it now before my clan's traditional methods of persuasion become obsolete. And tell me if this peculiar connection holds. From what strange, orderly realm are you listening? What year has the heavenly mandate decreed for you, and what hour do these bewildering tidings reach you? We're taking notes for the afterlife. Now sheathe your swords, they're less effective these days, and let us contemplate the glorious end of an era. An eerie silence hangs in the air, a stillness that has blanketed our land for over 2 centuries. For generations, the name Tokugawa has been whispered with a reverence bordering on fear. The Shogunate, in its infinite wisdom, deemed the outside world a corrupting influence, a plague to be avoided at all costs. And so, the gates were shut. We became a nation unto ourselves, a perfectly polished jewel, as some would say, tucked away from the vulgar grasp of the gaijin. Our world was one of strict order, of calculated beauty. A society where every man knew his place, from the humble farmer to the daimyo in his castle. For the samurai, like myself, it was an era of profound peace, a time to cultivate the soul, to perfect the art of the sword, and to compose poetry that spoke of cherry blossoms and fleeting mortality. It was a comfortable existence, a predictable one, perhaps too predictable. Life under the shogunate was a meticulously crafted play. We, the samurai, were the lead actors, our lives dictated by the rigid code of Bushido. Honor was our currency, loyalty our creed. We were the guardians of a fragile peace, our swords sheathed but never far from reach. The days were filled with ritual, with the quiet contemplation of Zen gardens, the gentle rustle of silk kimonos, and the silent nod of understanding between men of our station. We were the pinnacle of a society that valued tradition above all else. We were masters of our domain, our authority unquestioned. The whispers of the outside world, of their strange customs and even stranger technologies, were but distant murmurs, easily dismissed as the ramblings of barbarians. We were content in our splendid isolation, blissfully unaware that the foundations of our world were beginning to crack. But even the most perfect jewel can have its flaws. For all the talk of honor and glory, the long peace had rendered us ornamental. Our stipends, paid in rice, dwindled in value as a merchant class once considered the lowest of the low grew fat on their burgeoning wealth. We, who were born to wield the sword, found ourselves pushing paper, becoming little more than glorified accountants. The sting of this indignity was a bitter pill to swallow. We clung to our swords, to the symbols of our fading relevance, even as the world around us began to spin on a new axis. The quiet satisfaction of our isolation began to feel like a cage, its gilded bars slowly closing in, suffocating the very spirit of the warrior that we were sworn to uphold. The whispers from the coast grew louder, carried on the salt-laced wind. Tales of foreign ships, great black behemoths belching smoke, defying the shogun's decree and approaching our sacred shores. At first, they were dismissed as sailors' fables, the drunken fantasies of fishermen. But the sightings became more frequent, more brazen. The year was 1853 when the American Commodore Perry, a man with more cannons than sense, steamed into Edo Bay, demanding we open our doors to the world. It was a demand backed by the kind of firepower we could only dream of, a brutal and undeniable truth that shattered our self-imposed tranquility. The perfectly polished jewel was about to be forcibly pried from its setting. The shogun, bless his indecisive heart, capitulated. The treaties were signed, our ports thrown open to the rapacious appetites of the West. And just like that, the world we knew, the world our fathers and their fathers had known, began to unravel. The influx of foreign goods and ideas was a torrent. a flood that threatened to wash away everything we held dear. The once stable economy faltered, the price of rice soared, and the common folk grew restless. For us samurai, it was a profound humiliation. Our masters, the very men we had sworn to protect, had bowed to the will of hairy barbarians without a single sword being drawn. The concept was so alien, so utterly contrary to our code, that it planted a seed of doubt, a seed that would soon blossom into open rebellion. The ensuing years were a chaotic symphony of honor, gunfire, and the desperate cry for a return to the old ways. Some of us, the so-called men of high purpose, clung to the cry of Sono joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. We saw the shogunate's weakness as a betrayal, a stain upon our national honor. We yearned for the days when the emperor, a divine figurehead for centuries, would once again be the true ruler of Japan. We sharpened our blades, our hearts filled with a righteous fury, ready to spill our own blood and the blood of anyone who stood in our way, to restore what we believed was the natural order of things. The quiet poetry of peace was drowned out by the thunder of cannons and the clash of steel. This broadcast you are listening to is a relic of that tumultuous time, a ghost in the machine of a future we could never have envisioned. It is a testament to the death of an era, to the last gasps of the samurai spirit before it was extinguished by the relentless march of progress. If this glimpse into our world of fading honor and the deafening roar of change resonates with you, if you find a strange beauty in our tragic tale, then I implore you to honor our memory. Subscribe to this channel. Let our stories not be lost to the winds of time. Ensure that the echoes of our blades, the whispers of our poetry, and the thunder of our fall continue to be heard for generations to come. Join us and bear witness to the end of a world. The fall was as swift as it was brutal. The Bushido War, a civil war that pitted samurai against samurai, was a bloody affair. We fought with our ancestral blades, with the honor of our families etched into every swing. They fought with rifles and cannons with the cold, impersonal efficiency of modern warfare. It was a battle of ideals, a clash between the past and the future, and the future, it turned out, had a much higher rate of fire. The shogunate, the bedrock of our existence for over 2.5 centuries, crumbled to dust. The emperor, once a distant, godlike figure, was restored to power, his return heralding the dawn of a new era, the Meiji Restoration, an era that had no place for men like me. Our topknots were cut, our swords were outlawed, and our very reason for being was erased. We, the once proud guardians of Japan, became relics, curiosities in a world that was racing to embrace everything we had once held in contempt. The irony, it seems, is the sharpest blade of all. The summer of 1853 began as any other. The cicadas droned their monotonous song, the air hung thick and heavy with the promise of rain, and we, the samurai of Japan, went about our lives with the same stoic resignation that had defined our class for generations. We were the guardians of a timeless order, the living embodiment of a nation that had turned its back on the world. Our days were a tapestry of ritual and routine, a carefully choreographed dance of honor and duty. We practiced our swordsmanship, composed our poems, and looked down upon the burgeoning merchant class with a mixture of disdain and envy. The world beyond our shores was a distant, almost mythical place, a realm of hairy barbarians and their crude, uncultured ways. We were content in our splendid isolation, blissfully unaware that a storm was gathering on the horizon, a storm that would shatter our tranquility and leave us gasping for air. It began with whispers, strange tales from the fishermen of Edo Bay. They spoke of massive ships, black as a moonless night, moving without the aid of oars or sails, belching forth plumes of dark, acrid smoke. At first, we dismissed their stories as the ramblings of superstitious peasants, their minds addled by too much sake, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Too, we could see them for ourselves, 4 monstrous silhouettes against the rising sun, an affront to the natural order of things. They were not just ships, they were floating fortresses, bristling with cannons that seemed to mock our own antiquated defenses. They were a message, a declaration of intent from a world we had so long ignored, and we, the masters of this land, could do nothing but watch, in impotent rage, as they anchored in our sacred waters, their very presence a violation of our sovereignty. The leader of these interlopers was an American, a man named Matthew Perry. He was a Commodore, a title that meant little to us, but his arrogance was a language we understood all too well. He bore a letter from his president, a man named Fillmore, a name that sounded like a disease. The letter was a demand couched in the language of diplomacy, but with the unmistakable undertone of a threat. He wanted our ports opened, our coal to fuel his infernal machines, and a treaty that would bind us to the will of his nation. He was polite, I suppose, in the way a wolf is polite to a sheep before it devours it. He offered us gifts, trinkets of his industrial age, a miniature steam train that chugged along its tiny track, a marvel of engineering that only served to highlight our own technological backwardness. We were a people who had perfected the art of the sword, but we were woefully unprepared for the age of the cannon. The Shogunate, the military government that had ruled us for over 2.5 centuries, was thrown into a state of utter panic. They were a body accustomed to the slow, deliberate pace of internal politics, to the subtle art of negotiation and compromise. They were not prepared for gunboat diplomacy, for the crude and direct methods of these Western barbarians. They debated, they dithered, they consulted with soothsayers and priests. All the while the black ship sat in our bay, a constant looming reminder of our vulnerability. The daimyo, the great feudal lords, were summoned to Edo to offer their counsel, a move unprecedented in its scope. It was a tacit admission from the shogunate that they were out of their depth, that they could no longer rule with the absolute authority they had once enjoyed. The foundations of our world were beginning to crumble, and we, the samurai, were caught in the middle, our loyalty torn between our masters and our own sense of honor. The humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow. We, the descendants of warriors who had faced Mongol hordes, were now being dictated to by a handful of foreigners with loud cannons and even louder demands. Our swords, the symbols of our very soul, felt like little more than decorative trinkles in the face of their overwhelming firepower. The common folk, who had for so long regarded us with a mixture of awe and fear, now looked at us with a newfound pity. We were like caged tigers pacing back and forth in our gilded prison, our claws clipped, our teeth filed down. Some of us advocated for war, for a glorious death in the face of overwhelming odds. "Let us charge their ships," they cried. "Let us show these barbarians the true meaning of the samurai spirit." But it was a futile gesture, a romantic notion that would have resulted in nothing more than a pointless slaughter. Ultimately, the shogunate bowed to the inevitable. They accepted Perry's letter, promising to give him an answer upon his return the following year. It was a stalling tactic, a desperate attempt to buy time, but it was also a surrender. The moment we acknowledged the Americans' demands, the moment we allowed them to dictate the terms of our engagement, we had already lost. The aura of invincibility that had for so long surrounded the shogunate had been shattered. The people saw their leaders for what they were, weak, indecisive, and utterly incapable of protecting them from the outside world. The seeds of rebellion, long dormant beneath the surface of our rigid society, began to germinate in the fertile soil of our national shame. The cry of "Sono joy," "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," began to echo through the land, a rallying cry for all those who felt betrayed by the shogunate's cowardice. Perry returned, as promised, in 1854, this time with an even larger fleet. His message clear: we will not be denied. The Convention of Kanagawa was signed, a treaty that opened 2 of our ports to American ships and established a framework for future trade. It was a document born of coercion, a testament to the brutal reality of international politics. We had been forced to abandon our centuries-old policy of isolation, to expose ourselves to a world we neither understood nor trusted. The floodgates were opened, and with them came a torrent of foreign influence that would forever alter the course of our history. The carefully constructed world of the Tokugawa shogunate was beginning to unravel, thread by painful thread. The arrival of the black ships was more than just a political or military crisis. It was a profound psychological blow. It forced us to confront a deeply unsettling truth. Our civilization, which we had for so long believed to be superior, was in fact dangerously behind the times. Our reverence for tradition, our adherence to the old ways, had left us vulnerable, like a museum piece exposed to the harsh elements of the modern world. The shock of this realization sent ripples through every corner of our society. It was a moment of reckoning, a painful but necessary awakening from our self-imposed slumber. The world was changing, and we had to change with it, or risk being swept away by the tide of history. The immediate aftermath of the treaty was a period of chaos and confusion. The authority of the shogunate, already weakened by internal strife, was now openly questioned. Rival daimyo, long held in check by the power of the Tokugawa clan, began to assert their independence, forging their own alliances and pursuing their own agendas. The samurai, once the loyal enforcers of the shogunate's will, were now divided, their loyalties fractured. Some remained faithful to their masters, while others, disillusioned by their weakness, flocked to the banner of the emperor, seeing in him the only hope for a restoration of our national pride. The country was a tinderbox, and the arrival of the Americans had just thrown a lit match into the middle of it. For a samurai like myself, it was a time of profound existential crisis. Everything I had been taught to believe, everything I had held sacred, was now being called into question. The code of Bushido, with its emphasis on loyalty and honor, seemed hopelessly inadequate in this new world of cannons and commerce. What was the point of a perfectly executed sword stroke against a rifle bullet? What was the value of personal honor in a world where nations were governed by self-interest and military might? I was a relic, a living anachronism, a ghost from a bygone era. My skills, my values, my very reason for being were becoming obsolete. The world no longer had a place for men like me, and the bitterness of that realization was a poison that seeped into my very soul. The influx of foreigners brought with it a host of new problems. They brought their strange customs, their strange diseases, and their even stranger religion. They swaggered through our streets with an air of superiority, treating us as if we were a conquered people in our own land. Clashes between samurai and foreigners became increasingly common, fueled by a mixture of xenophobia and a desperate desire to reclaim our lost honor. Each incident only served to further inflame tensions, leading to demands for reparations from the Western powers and further concessions from the beleaguered shogunate. We were caught in a vicious cycle of violence and humiliation, each turn of the wheel pushing us closer to the brink of all-out war. The economic consequences of opening our country were just as devastating. The influx of cheap foreign goods destroyed our local industries, driving many artisans and craftsmen into poverty. The value of our currency plummeted, leading to rampant inflation and widespread social unrest. The carefully balanced economy of the Edo period, which had sustained us for over 2 centuries, was thrown into chaos. The merchants, who had at first welcomed the opportunities for trade, soon found themselves at the mercy of forces they could not control. The peasants, who had always borne the brunt of our society's hardships, suffered the most. Famines and uprisings became more frequent, further destabilizing the country and eroding the authority of the shogunate. Amidst this turmoil, a new sense of national identity began to emerge. For centuries, our loyalties had been local, directed towards our daimyo and our clan. But now, faced with a common external threat, we began to see ourselves as a single nation, as Japanese. The cry of Sono Joy was more than just a political slogan. It was a call to unity, a plea for all of us to set aside our differences and work together to defend our homeland. It was a powerful and seductive idea, one that resonated deeply with the samurai class, who had for so long been searching for a new sense of purpose. We were no longer just the retainers of a particular lord. We were the defenders of Japan, the guardians of the emperor. The shogunate, in a desperate attempt to cling to power, tried to suppress this growing nationalist sentiment. They cracked down on their critics, imprisoning and executing those who dared to speak out against their policies. But their efforts were in vain. The more they tried to tighten their grip, the more they alienated the very people they needed to rule. Their persecution only created more martyrs for the cause, further fueling the flames of rebellion. The country was slowly but surely slipping from their grasp, and they seemed powerless to stop it. They were like a man trying to build a dam with his bare hands to hold back a raging river. It was a noble effort, perhaps, but ultimately a futile one. And so we found ourselves on the cusp of a new era, a time of profound and violent change. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a sense of unease and uncertainty. The future was a blank scroll, and we did not know what would be written upon it. Would we be able to weather this storm, to adapt to this new world and emerge stronger, or would we be consumed by it, our culture and our identity erased by the relentless march of westernization? These were the questions that haunted our nights, that filled our waking moments with a sense of dread. The only thing we knew for sure was that the Japan of our fathers was gone forever, and the Japan of our sons was yet to be born. It is this story of unwelcome visitors and the chaos they unleashed that we will continue to explore. These tales of a nation forced to confront its own reflection in the polished brass of a foreign canon are not just history, they are a warning. A reminder that even the most secluded and perfect worlds can be shattered in an instant. If you find yourself captivated by this desperate struggle for survival, if you wish to hear more of our desperate cries against the storm, then you must act. Do not let our voices fade into the static of forgotten history. Subscribe to this channel, keep our broadcast alive, let the world know what happened when gunboat diplomacy became our foreign policy. The black ships were a harbinger, a dark omen of the changes to come. They were the catalyst that set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in the overthrow of the Shogunate and the restoration of the emperor. They were the shock that awakened us from our long, peaceful slumber and forced us to confront the realities of the modern world. The humiliation of that first encounter, the bitter taste of our own powerlessness, would linger for generations, shaping our national consciousness and fueling our drive to catch up with the West. It was a painful and brutal lesson, but perhaps a necessary one, for it was in the shadow of those black ships that the seeds of a new Japan were sown. A Japan that would rise from the ashes of the old to become a major power on the world stage. But that is a story for another time. For now, let us dwell on this moment of profound disruption, this collision of two worlds. Let us remember the fear, the anger, the confusion, and the desperate search for a way forward. Let us remember the men who stood on the shores of Edo Bay and watched as their world was turned upside down. Let us remember their faces, their voices, their story. For in their story lies the story of Japan itself, a nation defined by its ability to endure, to adapt, and to overcome. A nation that learned the hard way that politeness, no matter how refined, is no match for a well-aimed cannonball. The arrival of Perry was not just an encounter, it was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred space we had so carefully cultivated. Imagine a meticulously crafted garden, every rock placed with intention, every plant pruned to perfection. Now imagine a herd of wild boar rampaging through it, their hooves trampling the delicate moss, their snouts uprooting the ancient trees. That is what it felt like. The Americans, with their loud voices and their even louder machines, were a discordant note in the symphony of our lives. They did not understand our customs, our rituals, our deep-seated reverence for the past. They saw us as a backward people, a quaint and curious anachronism, and they treated us as such. The shogunate's response, or lack thereof, was perhaps the most galling part of it all. We, the samurai, were sworn to protect the honor of our nation, to defend it with our lives if necessary. Yet our leaders chose the path of appeasement, of capitulation. They signed treaties that were little more than instruments of our own subjugation. They granted concessions that chipped away at our sovereignty, piece by painful piece. It was a betrayal of everything we stood for, a stain upon our collective honor that would not be easily washed away. The sword of the samurai, once a symbol of our strength, now felt like a heavy burden, a reminder of our impotence. This sense of powerlessness bred a deep and abiding resentment, a slow-burning rage that simmered beneath the surface of our society. It was a resentment that was directed not only at the foreigners who had so rudely inserted themselves into our lives, but also at the shogunate that had failed to protect us from them. We were a proud people, a nation with a long and glorious history. We were not accustomed to being treated as second-class citizens in our own land. The humiliation of it all was a constant gnawing presence, a wound that refused to heal. And it was this wound, more than anything else, that would ultimately fester and lead to the downfall of the old regime. The black ships may have left our shores, but they left behind a legacy of turmoil and transformation. They had shattered the illusion of our invulnerability and exposed the weakness at the heart of our government. They had ignited a spark of nationalism that would soon engulf the entire country in flames. They had set us on a new and uncertain course, a course that would lead us through years of civil war and social upheaval. The age of the samurai was coming to an end, and a new age, the age of the gun and the steam engine, was dawning. We were standing on the precipice of a new world, and we did not know if we would be able to find our footing in it. The echoes of those cannon shots still reverberate through our history. They are a reminder of the day our isolation was shattered, the day the modern world came knocking at our door. They are a testament to the brutal realities of power, to the simple fact that history is written by those with the biggest guns. But they are also a testament to the resilience of our people, to our ability to learn, to adapt, and to forge a new destiny for ourselves. The story of the black ships is not just a story of humiliation and defeat. It is also a story of rebirth and renewal. It is the story of how a nation, brought to its knees, found the strength to rise again, stronger and more determined than ever before. And so, we stand at a crossroads, the past and the future pulling us in different directions. The old ways are dying, but the new ways have not yet fully taken root. It is a time of great peril, but also of great opportunity. It is a time for heroes and villains, for patriots and traitors. It is a time for men to choose a side, to decide what they are willing to fight for and what they are willing to die for. The fate of our nation hangs in the balance, and it is up to us, the children of this tumultuous age, to shape its destiny. The broadcast continues, a lonely voice in the gathering storm, a witness to the death of one world and the birth of another. Stay with us, the most dramatic act is yet to come. In the wake of the black ships, a strange fever gripped the nation. It was a fever of indignant rage, of wounded pride, a collective delirium born from the humiliation of our leaders. From the bustling streets of Edo to the secluded castles of the countryside, a new slogan began to take hold, whispered at first, then shouted from the rooftops, "Sono joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians." A beautifully simple phrase, wasn't it? It had a certain poetic ring to it, a noble sentiment that stirred the heart of every true samurai. It promised a return to a purer, more authentic Japan, a land free from the corrupting influence of the hairy, red-faced foreigners who now roamed our sacred soil with impunity. The reverence for the emperor was nothing new, of course. For centuries he had been the divine, albeit powerless, figurehead of our nation, a living god tucked away in the splendid isolation of his palace in Kyoto. The shogun ruled in his name, a convenient fiction that maintained the delicate balance of power, but now, with the shogunate's authority crumbling, the emperor became a potent symbol of national unity, a rallying point for all those who felt betrayed by the weak-kneed policies of the Tokugawa regime. To revere the emperor was to reject the shogun, to challenge the very foundations of the political order that had governed us for over 250 years. It was a revolutionary act, disguised as an act of piety. And then there was the second part of the slogan, "Expel the barbarians." Ah, yes, a sentiment that resonated deeply with our innate sense of superiority. We had spent centuries cultivating our unique culture, our refined aesthetics, our martial prowess. To see it all threatened by these uncouth, ill-mannered foreigners was an affront to our very being. The desire to drive them back into the sea from whence they came was a powerful and seductive one. It was a call to arms, a promise of a swift and violent solution to a complex geopolitical problem. It was also, as we would soon discover, a hopelessly naive and ultimately suicidal proposition. The Sono Joy movement was a broad church, attracting a motley crew of adherents. There were the idealists, the young, hot-blooded samurai who genuinely believed that they could, through sheer force of will and the sharpness of their blades, restore the glory of old Japan. They were the ones who wrote passionate poems about cherry blossoms and honor, and then went out and assassinated a shogunate official or two before breakfast. They were brave, they were foolish, and they were utterly convinced of their own righteousness. Their purity of purpose was almost admirable, in a terrifying, self-destructive sort of way. Then there were the opportunists, the ambitious daimyo from the outer domains of Satsuma and Choshu, who had long chafed under the yoke of Tokugawa rule. For them, sono joy was less a matter of principle and more a matter of political expediency. They saw the anti-foreigner sentiment as a convenient tool to weaken the shogunate, to rally support for their own cause, and to position themselves as the true defenders of the emperor and the nation. They were playing a dangerous game, a high-stakes gamble for control of Japan's future, and they were not afraid to shed a little blood, preferably someone else's, to achieve their goals. And of course there were the common folk, caught in the crossfire as always. For them, the arrival of the foreigners had brought nothing but hardship. Their livelihoods were destroyed by cheap foreign imports, their communities disrupted by the presence of swaggering, disrespectful gaijin. They embraced the sono joy slogan with a desperate fervor, hoping that it would somehow magically restore the stability and predictability of their former lives. They were the foot soldiers of this new movement, their anger and frustration a potent weapon in the hands of those who knew how to wield it. The clash between the traditionalists, who clung to the dream of expelling the barbarians, and the reformers, who argued for a more pragmatic approach, became the defining conflict of the era. The traditionalists, bless their hearts, were men of principle. They believed that any concession to the West was a betrayal of our national soul. They saw the adoption of foreign technology as a form of cultural surrender, as they were the ones who would charge a Gatling gun with a sword, convinced that their superior spirit would somehow prevail over a hail of bullets. It was a beautiful sentiment, right up until the moment of impact. The reformers, on the other hand, were men of a more practical bent. They had seen the black ships, they had felt the thunder of their cannons, and they had drawn the rather obvious conclusion that our traditional ways of war were, to put it mildly, obsolete. They argued that the only way to beat the barbarians was to join them, to learn their ways, to master their technology and to turn it against them. It was a deeply unpalatable idea to many, a form of heresy that bordered on treason, but it was also, as it turned out, the only path to survival. The tension between these two factions created a climate of intense political instability. The streets of our cities, once models of order and decorum, became scenes of frequent violence. Assassinations were a common occurrence, a sort of extreme form of political debate. Shogunate officials, foreign diplomats, and anyone suspected of harboring pro-Western sympathies were all potential targets for the swords of the shishi, the so-called men of high purpose, who had taken it upon themselves to purge the nation of its impurities. It was a dangerous time to have an opinion, especially if that opinion happened to be a sensible one. One of the most infamous incidents of this period was the assassination of Naosuke, the chief minister of the shogunate, in 1860. Was a pragmatist, a man who understood that Japan had no choice but to engage with the West. He had signed the treaties, he had cracked down on the sono joy radicals, and in doing so he had signed his own death warrant. He was cut down in broad daylight, just outside Edo Castle, by a band of samurai from the Mito domain. His death was a stark message to the shogunate. We will not be silenced. The era of polite disagreement was over. The era of the sword had begun. The violence was not limited to our own people. Foreigners, too, became targets of our righteous indignation. The Namamugi incident of 1862 is a perfect example. A British merchant named Charles Richardson had the misfortune of encountering the procession of a Satsuma daimyo on the Tokaido road. He failed to show the proper respect, a fatal error in judgment. He was cut down by the daimyo's retainers, a brutal and public execution that sent shockwaves through the foreign community. The British, not being ones to take such things lying down, retaliated by bombarding the city of Kagoshima. It was a harsh lesson in the realities of 19th-century international relations. A dead merchant could cost you a city. Suddenly, everyone wanted to expel the barbarians. A noble sentiment, unless you actually met a barbarian, then you mostly just wanted to run or get a better gun. The problem with the Sonia Joie movement was that it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. We saw them as uncivilized brutes, as morally and spiritually inferior. We failed to appreciate their technological superiority, their military discipline, their ruthless pragmatism. We were like a child shaking his fist at a tidal wave, our defiance both admirable and utterly futile. The Shogunate, caught between the demands of the foreigners and the fury of its own people, was paralyzed. Every move they made seemed to alienate one side or the other. If they cracked down on the radicals, they were accused of being puppets of the West. If they tried to appease the traditionalists, they risked a war they knew they could not win. They were walking a tightrope, and the winds of change were blowing with hurricane force. The once mighty Tokugawa regime was now a shadow of its former self, its authority eroding with each passing day. And what of us, the samurai, in all this? We were the heart and soul of the Sono-Joi movement, its most passionate and devoted followers, but we were also its primary victims. We were the ones who fought and died in the skirmishes with foreign troops, our bodies a testament to the tragic gap between our courage and our capabilities. We were the ones who were executed by the Shogunate for our revolutionary activities, our heads displayed on pikes as a warning to others. We were tearing our own class apart, brother against brother, in a desperate and bloody struggle for the soul of our nation. It was a time of great confusion, a time when old loyalties were tested and new ones were forged. A samurai's duty had always been clear, to serve his lord. But what if your lord was a weak-willed fool who was leading you down the path to ruin? What if the emperor, the divine sovereign of the nation, was calling for a different course of action? Where did your true loyalty lie? These were the questions that tormented us, that forced us to make impossible choices. For many of us, the answer was to become ronin, masterless samurai, free to follow the dictates of our own conscience, even if it led us to an early grave. If you're still trying to wrap your head around the beautiful, suicidal logic of our geopolitical slogan, then you have found your tribe. This broadcast is a journey into the heart of that glorious chaotic madness. To ensure you don't miss a single moment of our national identity crisis, you must subscribe. It's the honorable thing to do. By subscribing, you become a keeper of our story, a guardian of the echoes of our desperate cry. Do it now before the next wave of barbarians arrives and cuts the transmission. The reformers, particularly those from the powerful domains of Satsuma and Choshu, began to realize the folly of the original Sono-Joi slogan. They had seen firsthand the destructive power of Western weaponry. The bombardment of Kagoshima was a wake-up call for Satsuma, and a similar thrashing at the hands of a combined foreign fleet at Shimonoseki in 1864 convinced the leaders of Choshu that a change in strategy was needed. The new thinking was that you couldn't expel the barbarians without first learning from them. The slogan quietly evolved: rich country, strong army. It was a less poetic but far more practical motto for the times. This shift in thinking did not happen overnight, and it was not without its internal struggles. The more radical elements within the Sono-Joi movement saw this new pragmatism as a betrayal, a surrender to the very forces they were sworn to fight. The infighting was vicious, the purges bloody. But in the end, the realists won out. They began to secretly send students abroad to learn the ways of the West. They invested heavily in modern weapons, in building shipyards and foundries. They were still committed to overthrowing the shogunate and restoring the emperor, but they now had a much clearer and much more dangerous plan for how to do it. The shogunate, for its part, was not sitting idly by. They too were attempting to modernize, to build their own fleet, to train their own army in Western methods. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to catch up with their own rebellious domains. The country was effectively divided into two armed camps, both claiming to be acting in the best interests of the emperor and the nation, both stockpiling weapons and preparing for a final, decisive confrontation. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and intrigue. The civil war had not yet officially begun, but the first shots had already been fired. And so, the dream of expelling the barbarians died a quiet, unceremonious death. It was a beautiful dream, a romantic dream, a dream that spoke to the very core of our warrior spirit. But it was a dream that could not survive the harsh light of reality. We had learned our lesson, a lesson paid for in blood and fire. The world was a much larger and more dangerous place than we had ever imagined, and our only hope for survival was to find our place in it, not to hide from it. The irony, of course, is that in our quest to become strong enough to expel the barbarians, we had to become more like them. The Sono Joy movement, for all its flaws and contradictions, was a necessary catalyst for change. It shattered the complacency of the Tokugawa era, it awakened a new sense of national consciousness, and it set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to the Meiji Restoration. It was a messy, violent, and often irrational process, but it was also a period of intense creativity and dynamism. It was the crucible in which modern Japan was forged. For a samurai like myself, it was a bewildering and often heartbreaking time. I had been raised to believe in a world of clear-cut loyalties and timeless values, but that world was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of competing ideologies and shifting alliances. I saw friends and comrades die for causes that seemed noble one day and foolish the next. I saw the very foundations of my identity being eroded, my skills and my code of honor becoming increasingly irrelevant in a world where the rifle was mightier than the sword. The rise of the Sono Joy movement was the death knell of the old Japan. It was a fever that had to run its course, a violent convulsion that was necessary to purge the body politic of the sickness of stagnation. But the cure was almost as deadly as the disease. It unleashed forces that could not be easily controlled, forces that would tear our society apart before they could begin to rebuild it. The path to a new, modern Japan was paved with the bodies of those who had clung too tightly to the old ways. The slogan, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," may have failed in its literal sense, but it succeeded in a much more profound way. It succeeded in destroying the old order, in creating a power vacuum that would be filled by a new generation of leaders with a new vision for the future. It was the rallying cry that brought down the Shogunate and ushered in the era of the Emperor. The barbarians were not expelled, but the world they had forced upon us became the catalyst for our own transformation. And so, we found ourselves on the brink of a civil war, a war that would pit samurai against samurai, brother against brother. The ideals of Sono Joy had been twisted and transformed, the dream of a pure and isolated Japan replaced by the pragmatic goal of national survival. The stage was set for the final act of this tragic drama, the Boshin War. It would be a war fought with modern weapons and ancient loyalties, a war that would decide the fate of our nation for generations to come. The broadcast continues, but the signal is growing weaker. The storm is about to break. For centuries, the emperor was a concept more than a man, a divine presence, a living god, the son of heaven, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. His home was the imperial palace in Kyoto, a gilded cage where he performed the ancient rites, composed exquisite poetry, and spent his days in refined contemplation of the changing seasons. He was the spiritual heart of our nation, the ultimate source of all legitimacy. He was also, for all practical purposes, utterly irrelevant. The shogun, the military dictator in Edo, held all the real power. The emperor was a symbol, a very important and highly revered symbol, but a symbol nonetheless. He was the ultimate authority on flower arranging, but his opinion on matters of state was neither sought nor desired. The Tokugawa shogunate had perfected the art of keeping the emperor in his place. They showered him with wealth, they surrounded him with ceremony, they buried him under layers of ritual and protocol. They controlled his access to the outside world, they vetted his appointments, they ensured that no ambitious court noble could whisper dangerous ideas into the imperial ear. The emperor was a tool, a very effective one, used to legitimize the shogun's rule. The shogun governed in the emperor's name. A clever bit of political theater that had maintained the peace for over 250 years. We, the samurai, swore our loyalty to our daimyo, who in turn swore their loyalty to the shogun. The emperor was a distant, almost mythical figure. a name we invoked in our prayers but rarely in our daily lives. But then came the black ships and everything changed. The shogunate's authority, once as solid as Mount Fuji, began to crumble. Their inability to stand up to the foreigners, their humiliating treaties, their desperate attempts to cling to power, all served to expose their weakness. And as the shogun's star began to fall, the emperors began to rise. The "Revere the Emperor," part of the Sonojo's slogan, which had at first been a convenient excuse to bash the shogunate, started to take on a life of its own. People began to wonder, if the shogun could no longer protect the nation, then perhaps it was time for the true ruler of Japan to take back the reins of power. The emperor in question was a young man, a boy really, named Mutsuhito. He ascended to the chrysanthemum throne in 1867 at the tender age of 14. He had spent his entire life cloistered within the walls of the imperial palace, his education focused on the classical arts, his understanding of the world shaped by the carefully curated information that was fed to him. He was a blank slate, a symbol waiting to be inscribed, and the ambitious daimyo of Satsuma and Choshu, along with a cabal of reform-minded court nobles, saw in him the perfect instrument for their own revolutionary ambitions. They began to cultivate a relationship with the young emperor, bypassing the shogunate's intermediaries, whispering in his ear the tales of their nation's humiliation and the shogun's incompetence. They painted a picture of a Japan in crisis, a nation crying out for a strong and decisive leader. They presented themselves as his loyal servants, the only ones who could restore the honor of the nation and the glory of the imperial throne. The emperor, who had spent his life as a ceremonial puppet, was suddenly being told that he was the savior of his people. He seems just as surprised as we are. It was a brilliant political move, a masterstroke of propaganda. The shogun could claim to be the military ruler of Japan, but he could never claim the divine right that belonged to the emperor alone. By positioning themselves as the champions of the emperor, the leaders of Satsuma and Choshu seized the moral high ground. They were no longer rebels seeking to overthrow the established order. They were loyalists seeking to restore the rightful ruler to his throne. Their rebellion was transformed into a restoration, their quest for power cloaked in the noble language of imperial devotion. The court nobles, who had for so long been relegated to the sidelines of power, played a crucial role in this unfolding drama. Men like Iwakura Tomomi, a cunning and ambitious courtier, became the secret architects of the restoration. They were the ones who forged the alliances between the outer domains and the imperial court, who drafted the secret decrees that authorized Satsuma and Choshu to take up arms against the shogunate. They were playing a dangerous game, one that could have easily cost them their heads, but they were driven by a genuine belief that the old system was broken, and that only a direct imperial rule could save Japan from the clutches of the West. The shogunate, of course, was not blind to what was happening. They saw the growing influence of their rivals in Kyoto. They saw the ground shifting beneath their feet. They tried to reassert their authority, to bring the imperial court back into line, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The emperor, once their most valuable asset, had become their most dangerous enemy. He was no longer a passive symbol to be manipulated. He was an active player in the game, a symbol of national unity that was being used to rally the country against them. The final break came in late 1867. The leaders of Satsuma and Choshu, armed with a secret imperial decree, marched their troops into Kyoto and seized control of the imperial palace. On the 3rd of January 1868, they issued an edict in the young Emperor Meiji's name, declaring the restoration of imperial rule and the abolition of the Tokugawa shogunate. It was a coup d'etat, plain and simple, but it was a coup d'etat wrapped in the sacred authority of the Son of Heaven. The shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, a man who had tried to reform the system from within, was now declared an enemy of the court. The reaction among the samurai class was one of profound confusion. We had been raised to be loyal to the shogunate, to see it as the legitimate government of Japan. But we had also been taught to revere the emperor as a living god. Now we were being told that our loyalty to the shogun was a betrayal of our duty to the emperor. It was a paradox that twisted our minds and tore at our souls. We were being asked to choose between two conflicting loyalties, and either choice felt like a betrayal. The very foundations of our moral universe were collapsing. For many of us, the choice was made for us by our daimyo. If our lord declared for the emperor, then we would follow him. If he remained loyal to the shogunate, then we would stand with him. But even this was not always a simple matter. The domains themselves were often divided, with pro-imperial and pro-shogunate factions vying for control. The civil war that was about to erupt was not just a war between large armies. It was a war that would be fought in the castles, in the villages, and in the hearts of individual samurai. The young Emperor Meiji, the symbol at the center of this storm, remained an enigmatic figure. Did he truly understand the forces that were being unleashed in his name? Did he believe in the revolution that was being carried out on his behalf? Or was he simply a pawn in a larger game, a convenient figurehead for ambitious men who were using his name to legitimize their own quest for power? It was impossible to know. He was a symbol, and symbols are by their very nature open to interpretation. What was clear, however, was that the emperor's return to political power, or at least the appearance of it, had changed the game entirely. It had given the anti-shogunate movement a legitimacy that it had previously lacked. It had transformed a regional rebellion into a national revolution. It had provided a powerful and unifying symbol for a country that was desperately searching for a new identity. The boy who had once been known for his skill in flower arranging was now the face of a new Japan. This broadcast is a chronicle of that seismic shift, a testament to the power of a single, well-placed symbol. To ensure you remain on the right side of history, to support our return to divine authority, you must act. Hit that subscribe button before the next political earthquake reduces us all to rubble. Subscribing is not just a choice, it is a declaration of loyalty. Join the restoration. The emperor commands it. Probably. The great irony of the Meiji Restoration is that it was not a restoration at all, at least not in the sense of a return to the past. The men who led the movement in the emperor's name had no intention of turning back the clock. They were not traditionalists seeking to expel the barbarians and restore the old ways. They were modernizers, pragmatists who understood that Japan had to change in order to survive. They were using the most ancient and sacred institution in Japan, the imperial throne, to launch the most radical and far-reaching revolution in our history. The Boshin War, the civil war that followed the declaration of the Restoration, was the bloody and inevitable consequence of this contradiction. On one side were the forces of the new imperial government, a coalition of the powerful Western domains, armed with modern weapons and a clear vision for the future. On the other side were the forces of the now-defunct Shogunate, a collection of loyalist domains fighting to preserve a system that was already dead. It was a war of ideals, a war of technologies, a war that would determine the course of our nation for the next century. The Emperor Meiji, in whose name this war was being fought, was moved from Kyoto to the shogun's former castle in Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital. It was a powerful symbolic move, a clear declaration that a new era had begun. The center of power was no longer the shogun's military government, it was the emperor's imperial court. The boy who had once been a prisoner in his own palace was now the ruler of all Japan, at least in name. The men who had put him there were now the real power behind the throne, ready to begin the monumental task of building a new nation. And what a task it was! They had to dismantle a feudal system that had been in place for centuries. They had to create a modern, centralized government. They had to build a new army and a new navy. They had to reform the economy, the legal system, the education system. They had to do all of this while fending off the predatory ambitions of the Western powers and dealing with the internal resistance of those who were not so keen on this brave new world. It was a daunting, almost impossible undertaking. The return of the emperor was the essential first step in this process. He was the glue that held it all together, the symbol of unity that transcended the old feudal loyalties. Without him, the Meiji Restoration would have been nothing more than a power grab by a handful of ambitious daimyo. With him, it became a national project, a collective effort to build a rich country and a strong army, one that could stand on an equal footing with the nations of the West. He was the sun around which the new Japan would revolve. For a samurai like myself, it was a time of both hope and despair. Hope, because the restoration of the emperor seemed to offer a chance to reclaim our national pride, to wash away the stain of our humiliation at the hands of the foreigners. Despair, because it soon became clear that this new Japan had no place for men like me. The reforms that were being carried out in the emperor's name were designed to dismantle the very system that had given us our status and our purpose. We were being asked to sacrifice ourselves on the altar of progress. The abolition of the domains, the creation of a conscript army, the stripping of our exclusive right to wear 2 swords, each reform was another nail in the coffin of the samurai class. We, who had been the architects of the revolution, were now becoming its victims. The irony was not lost on us. We had fought to restore the emperor, only to find that the emperor's new government saw us as an obstacle to its plans. We were relics of a bygone era, and the new Japan was in a hurry to move on. The young emperor, as he grew into his role, proved to be a surprisingly adept and intelligent ruler. He was not the mere puppet that some had expected him to be. He embraced the reforms, he became a powerful advocate for modernization, and he presided over the most rapid and successful industrial revolution in human history. He was the perfect symbol for a nation in transition, a bridge between the old and the new. He was the embodiment of the Meiji spirit, a spirit of relentless ambition and tireless self-improvement. But, for all the talk of a return to divine authority, the reality was far more complex. The emperor reigned, but he did not rule. The power was in the hands of a small group of oligarchs, the men from Satsuma and Choshu who had led the restoration. They were the ones who made the decisions, who drafted the laws, who shaped the destiny of the nation. The emperor was their symbol, their source of legitimacy, but they were the ones who were truly in charge. The new Japan was not an absolute monarchy, it was an oligarchy with an imperial face. And so, the great political earthquake had come and gone, and the landscape of our nation was forever changed. The shogunate was gone, the samurai class was dying, and a new, centralized and modernizing state was rising from the ashes of the old. At the center of it all was the emperor, a young man who had been plucked from obscurity and placed at the helm of a revolution. He was a symbol of our ancient past and our ambitious future, a living god who had been tasked with leading his people into the modern world. It was a heavy burden for a young man to bear, but he bore it with a quiet dignity that earned him the respect and devotion of his people. The broadcast continues, but the voice you hear is now just an echo from a world that no longer exists. Of all the indignities the barbarians brought to our shores, none was more profoundly unsettling than their obsession with firearms. It wasn't that we were unfamiliar with guns. Our ancestors had encountered them centuries ago, thanks to some shipwrecked Portuguese. We even manufactured our own for a time, before our wise leaders decided that they were a rather vulgar and dishonorable way to settle disputes. We locked them away, preferring the elegant finality of a well-aimed sword stroke. We chose art over efficiency, a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable until the Americans arrived with their floating arsenals and reminded us that efficiency has a certain brutal charm of its own. The guns that began to flood our country in the 1850s and 60s were a different breed entirely from the primitive matchlocks of old. These were rifles, long, sleek instruments of death with strange names like Mini and Snyder Enfield. They were precision-made, capable of hitting a man from a distance that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago. They fired bullets that spun through the air, delivering a devastating impact that could shatter bone and tear through flesh with gruesome ease. They were a marvel of engineering, a testament to the West's relentless pursuit of more effective ways to kill each other. For a samurai whose entire identity was tied to his sword, the proliferation of these weapons was a deeply personal affront. My katana, a blade that had been in my family for generations, was a work of art, a masterpiece of folded steel, its edge so sharp it could split a hair. It was an extension of my soul, the physical embodiment of my honor. To master its use required a lifetime of dedication, a grueling regimen of training that honed the body and disciplined the mind. It was a path, a way of life. The gun, by contrast, was an abomination. It was a coward's weapon, a tool that allowed the weakest peasant to kill the most skilled warrior with a simple pull of a trigger. The psychological impact of this new reality was profound. We had always understood the battlefield as a place of personal combat, a stage upon which a man's courage and skill were put to the ultimate test. It was a dance of death, a contest of wills where you looked your enemy in the eye and saw the reflection of your own mortality. The gun changed all of that. It turned warfare into an impersonal, almost industrial process. You no longer fought a man, you fought a target, a distant silhouette that you might never see up close. The honor, the glory, the very artistry of combat was replaced by the cold, hard mathematics of ballistics. The devastating effectiveness of these new weapons was demonstrated time and again in the bloody clashes that preceded the Bushin War, in the skirmishes between the forces of Choshu and the Shogunate, in the punitive bombardments carried out by the Western powers. The story was always the same. A small force armed with modern rifles could hold off a much larger force armed with traditional weapons. The sight of our finest samurai, men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the sword, being cut down from a distance by an unseen enemy, was a sight that chilled the very marrow of our bones. It was a brutal and undeniable truth. Our way of war was dead. And the sound was something else entirely. The crack of a rifle, the deafening roar of a cannon, the whistle of a bullet as it flew past your ear, these were the sounds of the new Japan, a discordant symphony that drowned out the quiet dignity of the past. The battlefield was no longer a place of controlled violence, of ritualized combat. It was a hellscape of noise and smoke and chaos, a place where a man could die without ever seeing the face of his killer. It was terribly unfair, and very, very loud. The race to acquire these new weapons became the central obsession of both the shogunate and its rebellious domains. Foreign arms dealers, smelling a profit, descended upon our shores like vultures to a carcass. They sold to anyone who could pay, fueling an arms race that would soon spiral out of control. The port of Nagasaki became a bustling marketplace of death, where you could buy anything from a single-shot pistol to a multi-barreled Gatling gun, a monstrous contraption that could spit out 200 rounds a minute. We were a nation on the brink of civil war, and the barbarians were more than happy to sell us the tools to destroy ourselves. The irony was that in our desperate quest to resist the West, we became their best customers. We embraced their technology of death with a fervor that was almost religious. The very domains that had once been the most vocal proponents of expelling the barbarians were now the most enthusiastic adopters of their weapons. The leaders of Satsuma and Choshu, for all their talk of national pride, were not fools. They understood that you could not fight a rifle with a sword, and they were determined to give their men the best possible chance of survival. Their samurai may have grumbled about the dishonor of it all, but they were not so foolish as to refuse a weapon that could save their life. For a time, we tried to find a middle ground. We tried to integrate the gun into our traditional way of fighting. We formed units of riflemen to support our samurai charges. We tried to use our superior swordsmanship to overwhelm the enemy in close-quarters combat. But it was a losing battle. The gun was not a weapon that could be easily integrated into our existing tactics. It was a weapon that demanded a whole new way of thinking about war. It required discipline, drill, and a willingness to abandon the individualistic ethos of the samurai in favor of the collective firepower of the modern infantry unit. The psychological shift was perhaps the most difficult part of the transition. We had been raised to see ourselves as individual heroes, as masters of our own destiny on the battlefield. The gun reduced us to cogs in a machine. Our personal courage, our skill with the sword, our years of training, they all meant very little in the face of a well-aimed volley of rifle fire. We were being asked to become something we were not, to abandon the very essence of what it meant to be a samurai. It was a bitter pill to swallow, a surrender of the soul that was, for many of us, more painful than death itself. The Bushin War, when it finally came, was the ultimate showcase for this new and terrible form of warfare. The opening battle at Toba Fushimi, just outside Koto, was a slaughter. The forces of the shogunate, though outnumbering the imperial army, were armed with a hodgepodge of outdated weapons. The forces of Satsuma and Choshu, by contrast, were equipped with the latest rifles and cannons, and they used them with a devastating efficiency. The battle was over in a matter of days, the shogunate's army routed, their dreams of a swift victory shattered. The age of the sword was officially over. As the war progressed, the technological gap only widened. The imperial forces, with their superior resources and their access to foreign expertise, were able to field an army that was increasingly modern in its equipment and its tactics. The shogunate's forces, on the other hand, were forced to rely on a motley collection of loyalist domains, many of whom were still clinging to their traditional ways of fighting. It was a war between the future and the past never stood a chance. There were moments of heroism, of course. There were desperate last stands, where samurai armed with nothing more than their swords and their indomitable spirit charged into the teeth of enemy fire. The story of the Shinsengumi, the shogun's elite police force in Kyoto, is a testament to this tragic bravery. They were men who lived and died by the sword, who refused to surrender to the inevitable. They were magnificent, they were brave, and they were all but wiped out. Their story is a poignant reminder that courage alone is no match for a cannonball. This broadcast is a dispatch from the front lines of that perplexing new reality. We are trying to make sense of a world where honor is measured in caliber and courage is rendered obsolete by a piece of lead. If you too are struggling to understand these new and terrifying weapons, if you wish to help us decipher the instruction manuals for our own demise, then you must subscribe. It is the only way to ensure that our last words are not lost in the deafening roar of progress. Subscribe now, before we are all rendered tragically and loudly out of date. The psychological toll on the individual samurai was immense. Imagine spending your entire life honing a single exquisite skill, only to have it rendered useless overnight. Imagine being told that the very thing that gives you your identity, your purpose, your sense of self-worth, is now an anachronism. It was a crisis of meaning, a spiritual emptiness that was, for many, more devastating than any physical wound. Some adapted, of course. They put away their swords, they learned to drill, they became officers in the new imperial army, they swallowed their pride and did what was necessary to survive. But many others could not or would not make that leap. They were the true believers, the ones who could not let go of the past. They saw the adoption of Western weapons as a betrayal of everything it meant to be Japanese, as a surrender to the very forces they were supposed to be fighting. They clung to their swords as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood, a last desperate symbol of a world that was slipping away. Their fate was a tragic one, a slow and painful slide into irrelevance. The gun did more than just change the way we fought. It changed the very fabric of our society. The samurai class had always been defined by its monopoly on violence. We were the warriors, the protectors, the enforcers of the peace. The gun democratized violence. It put the power to kill into the hands of anyone who could afford to buy it. A peasant with a rifle was, on the battlefield, the equal of a samurai with a sword. This was a profoundly unsettling idea, one that threatened the very foundations of our social order. If anyone could be a warrior, then what was the point of being a samurai? The new imperial government, in its relentless drive to modernize, was quick to recognize this fact. One of their first and most controversial reforms was the creation of a national conscript army, an army made up of commoners, not samurai. It was a move that was both practical and symbolic. It was practical because it provided them with a large and relatively cheap source of manpower. It was symbolic because it sent a clear message. The age of the samurai was over. The defense of the nation was no longer the exclusive privilege of a hereditary warrior class. It was the duty of every Japanese citizen. The final insult came in 1876 with the Heishorai Edict, an imperial decree that banned the wearing of swords in public. The two swords, the daisho, the very symbol of our status and our soul, were now forbidden. It was a humiliation that cut deeper than any blade. We were being stripped of our identity, our history, our very reason for being. We were being told to become like everyone else, to blend in with the faceless masses of the New Japan. For many of us, it was a fate worse than death. The gun had not only conquered us on the battlefield, it had conquered us in our hearts and minds. It had forced us to abandon our most cherished traditions, to question our most deeply held beliefs. It had remade us in its own image, a nation that now valued efficiency over artistry, firepower over honor. We had learned the lesson that the West had come to teach us, that in the modern world, power grows out of the barrel of a gun. It was a bitter and cynical lesson, but it was one that we had learned all too well. The sword did not disappear entirely, of course. It became a symbol of a different kind, a romanticized icon of a lost golden age. It became the stuff of legends, of plays and stories, and woodblock prints. It became a museum piece, a beautiful and deadly relic of a time when honor was something you could hold in your hand. But as a weapon of war, as a practical tool for settling disputes, its day was done. The future belonged to the gun. And so, we found ourselves in a world that we no longer recognized, a world where our skills were useless and our values were obsolete. We were ghosts in our own land, haunted by the memory of a time when the sword was king. We watched as the new Japan, a Japan built on the foundations of Western technology, rose from the ashes of the old. We saw the factories and the railroads and the telegraph lines, and we knew that there was no going back. The world had moved on, and it had left us behind. The irony is that the very guns that had destroyed our world were now the tools that were being used to build a new one. The new imperial army, armed with the latest rifles and cannons, became the instrument of Japanese expansion, the tool that would be used to create an empire of our own. We had learned the lessons of the barbarians all too well. We had become what we beheld. This broadcast is a fading echo from that age of brutal transition. It is the sound of a world dying and a new one being born in a hail of gunfire. The lessons are harsh, the technology perplexing. To help us navigate this strange new world where the pen is no longer mightier than the sword, but the bullet is mightier than both, you must subscribe. Your subscription is a shield against the onslaught of progress, a way to preserve the memory of a time when a man's worth was measured by the quality of his steel, not the size of his arsenal. Join us. The future is loud, and we need all the help we can get. Bushido, the way of the warrior. For centuries it was our compass, our anchor, the very bedrock of our existence. It was a simple, elegant code, a set of virtues that guided our every action. Gi for justice, Yu for courage, Jin for benevolence, Rei for respect, Makod for honesty, Meio for honor, and Chugi for loyalty. It was a beautiful and demanding path, one that transformed a simple soldier into a warrior poet, a man of both culture and conviction. We believed it to be as timeless and immutable as the mountains, a moral framework that could withstand any storm. And then the storm came, and we discovered that our compass was spinning wildly, our anchor was dragging, and our bedrock was turning to sand beneath our feet. The first and most sacred of our virtues, Chugi loyalty, was the first to be thrown into chaos. For 2.5 centuries, our loyalty had been a simple, straightforward affair. We were loyal to our daimyo, who was loyal to the shogun. But now we were being told that our loyalty to the shogun was a betrayal of our higher duty to the emperor. It was a brilliant and deeply cynical move by the leaders of Satsumu and Choshu, one that turned our most cherished virtue against us. We were being forced to choose between the man who had been our master for generations and the man who was our god. It was a choice that tore at the very fabric of our souls, a moral catch-22 from which there was no honorable escape. Then there was the matter of courage. For a samurai, courage was not just the absence of fear, it was a very specific and highly stylized form of bravery. It was the courage to charge into the fray, to face your enemy eye to eye, to die a glorious death with your sword in your hand. But what did courage mean in the age of the cannon? What was the virtue in a suicidal charge against a line of rifles? Honor dictates one charges bravely. Modern weaponry dictates one ducks. My Bushido manual needs a serious update. Suddenly the line between courage and stupidity had become dangerously blurred. The virtue of Rei, respect, also took a severe beating. We were a society built on a rigid hierarchy of respect. We bowed to our superiors, we showed deference to our elders, we treated our enemies with a certain grudging admiration. But the foreigners, with their strange customs and their even stranger sense of entitlement, had no respect for our ways. They swaggered through our streets, they ignored our protocols, they treated us with a condescending arrogance that made our blood boil, and our own leaders, in their haste to appease these barbarians, seemed to have forgotten the meaning of self-respect. It was hard to maintain a sense of decorum when your world was being turned upside down by a bunch of ill-mannered savages. And what of Jin, benevolence? We were taught that a true warrior should be compassionate, that he should use his strength to protect the weak. But how could we be benevolent when we were being asked to kill our own countrymen in a bloody civil war? How could we show compassion to a peasant who had been conscripted into the enemy's army? A man who was fighting not out of conviction but out of fear. The new warfare was a brutal and indiscriminate affair, one that left little room for the finer points of our moral code. It was a business of killing, and business was booming. The virtue of Makoto, honesty, became a casualty of the political intrigues that swirled around us. We were a people who valued sincerity, who believed that a man's word was his bond, but in this new age of revolution and rebellion, deception had become a tool of statecraft. The leaders of the Restoration spoke of their loyalty to the emperor, but their true loyalty was to their own ambition. They spoke of expelling the barbarians, even as they were buying their weapons and hiring their advisors. It was a world of smoke and mirrors, a world where the truth was a commodity to be bought and sold, and we, the samurai, were the ones who were paying the price. But it was Meiyo, our personal honor, that suffered the most grievous wound. Our honor was our most prized possession, the very essence of our identity. It was something we cultivated, protected, and were willing to die for. But how could we maintain our honor in a world that seemed determined to strip it from us? We were being rendered obsolete by technology. We were being forced to abandon our traditions. We were being stripped of our status and our purpose. The world no longer valued the things we held dear, and the sense of shame that this engendered was a poison that seeped into our very souls. The dilemma of the gun was perhaps the most acute manifestation of this crisis of honor. To use a firearm was to admit that your skill with the sword, the very thing that defined you as a samurai, was no longer enough. It was a tacit admission of your own inferiority, a surrender to the crude and dishonorable ways of the barbarian. And yet, to refuse to use a gun was to condemn yourself to a pointless and inglorious death. It was a choice between dishonor and obsolescence, and either way the samurai lost. The code of Bushido had no answers for these new and terrifying questions. It was a code that had been developed for a different time, for a different world. It was a code that spoke of duels and honor, not of artillery barrages and strategic retreats. We were like men trying to navigate a stormy sea with a map of a serene and peaceful lake. Our moral compass was broken, and we were adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Some of us tried to adapt, of course. We tried to find a way to reconcile the old code with the new realities. We told ourselves that true courage was not about dying foolishly, but about living to fight another day. We told ourselves that true loyalty was not about blind obedience to a failing regime, but about serving the best interests of the nation. We twisted and reinterpreted the old virtues, trying to make them fit a world that they were never designed for. It was a desperate and often unconvincing act of self-preservation. Others simply gave up. They saw the writing on the wall, they understood that their world was gone forever, and they chose to retreat into a life of quiet obscurity. They put away their swords, they became farmers or teachers or merchants. They tried to forget that they had ever been samurai. It was a quiet and dignified surrender, a recognition that the game had changed and that they were no longer willing or able to play. And then there were the purists, the true believers, the ones who refused to compromise, who refused to bend. They were the ones who clung to the old code with a fierce and desperate intensity, who saw every change as a betrayal, every innovation as a corruption. They were the ones who charged into the cannons, their swords held high, their hearts full of a righteous and suicidal fury. They were magnificent, they were tragic, and they were doomed. The internal conflict was a constant and gnawing presence. We were men at war with ourselves, torn between the ideals we had been raised to believe in and the brutal realities of the world we were now living in. We were a warrior class without a war to fight, at least not a war that we understood. We were actors on a stage where the script had been rewritten, and we no longer knew our lines. The resulting performance was a tragic comedy of epic proportions. If you are finding this moral quandary, this existential crisis of an entire warrior class, as fascinating as it is deeply unsettling, then you have a duty, an honorable obligation. Smash that subscribe button now. Do not allow this broadcast, this chronicle of a collapsing moral universe, to fade into silence. Subscribing is your way of telling the world that you understand our struggle, that you appreciate the dark, absurd humor of trying to apply an ancient code of honor to a world gone mad. Do it. For the sake of my increasingly flexible definition of Bushido, the Shinsengumi, the shogun's special police in Kyoto, were perhaps the most famous and tragic examples of this purist mindset. They were a band of masterless samurai, of ronin, who had dedicated themselves to upholding the old order. They were superb swordsmen, they were fiercely loyal to the shogunate, and they lived and breathed the code of Bushido. They were also ruthless and brutal, a force of terror that cut down anyone they suspected of being an imperialist sympathizer. They were the dying gasp of the old samurai spirit, a final, bloody-minded refusal to accept the inevitability of change. Their story is one of unwavering loyalty in the face of certain defeat. They fought to the bitter end even after the shogun himself had surrendered. They retreated to the north, fighting a desperate and hopeless rearguard action against the overwhelming forces of the new imperial government. They died almost to a man, their swords shattered, their bodies riddled with the bullets of the new era. They chose honor over survival, and in doing so, they became legends. But legends do not win wars. On the other side of the conflict, there were men like Saigo Takamori, the great leader of the Satsuma domain. He was a man who embodied the traditional samurai virtues of courage, sincerity, and self-sacrifice. He was also a pragmatist, a modernizer who understood that Japan had to change in order to survive. He was a key figure in the Meiji Restoration, one of the architects of the New Japan. And yet, he could never fully reconcile himself with the world he had helped to create. In the end, Saigo too became a rebel. He led the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. A final, tragic uprising of the samurai against the new government they had put in power. It was a protest against the destruction of the samurai class, against the loss of their status and their way of life. It was a rebellion born of a broken heart, a last desperate attempt to turn back the clock. It failed, of course. Gaigo and his followers were crushed by the new conscript army, an army that he himself had helped to create. He died the traditional samurai death of seppuku, a final, poignant act of defiance against a world that no longer had a place for him. The stories of the Shinsengumi and Saigo Takamori are two sides of the same coin. They are the stories of men who were trapped between two worlds, who could not or would not adapt to the new realities. They are the stories of the tragedy of Bushido, a code that was both a source of immense strength and a fatal flaw. It was a code that gave us the courage to face death, but not the flexibility to embrace change. The psychological toll of this internal conflict was devastating. It led to a sense of alienation, of purposelessness, of a deep and abiding melancholy. We were a people in mourning, not just for our dead comrades, but for our dead way of life. The world had become a strange and unfamiliar place, a world without honor, without poetry, without the clear and simple certainties of the past. We were exiles in our own land, strangers in our own skin. The government's solution to this problem was a typically pragmatic one. They offered us a new kind of Bushido, a state property version of the old code that was stripped of its feudal trappings and repurposed to serve the needs of the modern nation-state. This new Bushido emphasized loyalty to the emperor, obedience to the state, and a willingness to sacrifice oneself for the greater good of the nation. It was a clever and effective piece of social engineering, one that harnessed the powerful energies of the old samurai spirit and channeled them into the project of building a new Japanese empire. But for many of us who had lived through the chaos of the Restoration, this new, sanitized version of Bushido rang hollow. It was a ghost of the real thing, a shadow without substance. It was a code that had been ripped from its context, that had lost its soul. The true spirit of Bushido, the spirit of individual honor and personal integrity, had died on the battlefields of the Boshin War. a casualty of the very forces that it had helped to unleash. The struggle to maintain our honor in a world that was rapidly losing its own was the defining struggle of our generation. It was a struggle that we fought not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet and lonely recesses of our own hearts. It was a struggle that most of us lost. But in the losing, perhaps we found a different kind of honor, the quiet honor of endurance, the stoic honor of a man who knows he is beaten, but refuses to surrender his soul. And so we carried on, we the survivors, we the relics of a bygone age. We watched as the new Japan rose around us, a nation that was both a source of immense pride and a cause for profound sorrow. We were the ghosts at the feast, the silent witnesses to a future that we had helped to create, but could never truly belong to. Our honor was in retreat, our code was under siege, but our memories, at least, were our own. And in the telling of our story, perhaps we could find a final, fleeting measure of redemption. This broadcast is that last act of defiance, a final attempt to find meaning in the wreckage of our lives. It is a testament to the enduring power of a code that, even in its death throes, could still inspire acts of breathtaking courage and profound foolishness. The moral quandaries are deep, the compromises are painful, and the outcome is, to put it mildly, uncertain. To continue this journey into the heart of our shattered honor, you know what you must do. The subscribe button is your sword. Wield it with courage. And so, it finally came to this. After years of simmering tensions, of political maneuvering and back-alley assassinations, the polite fiction that had held our nation together finally shattered. The year was 1868, and the Boshin War, the War of the Year of the Dragon, was upon us. It was a civil war, a conflict that pitted brother against brother, domain against domain, samurai against samurai. It was the culmination of everything that had been building since the black ships first appeared in Edo Bay, a violent and bloody exorcism of the ghosts that had haunted us for a generation. All the talk of honor and loyalty, of reverence for the emperor and expulsion of the barbarians, was now to be settled in the only way we truly understood, by force of arms. The lines were drawn, though they were often blurry and prone to shifting. On one side stood the new imperial government, a coalition of the powerful western domains of Satsuma and Choshu, along with their allies. They fought under the brocade banner of the emperor, claiming to be the righteous army of a restored monarchy. They were the modernizers, the pragmatists, the ones who had embraced the technology of the West in order to forge a new and stronger Japan. They had the best guns, the best training, and a clear, if ruthless, vision for the future. On the other side were the forces loyal to the Tokugawa Shogunate, a collection of domains primarily from the north and east of Japan. They were the traditionalists, the conservatives, the ones who were fighting to preserve the old order. They were led by men who still believed in the sanctity of the shogunate, who saw the imperial restoration as nothing more than a power grab by their ambitious Western rivals. They had courage, they had honor, and they had a deep and abiding attachment to a world that was already slipping through their fingers. The tragic irony of it all was that we were fighting our own countrymen. The men we faced across the battlefield were not foreign barbarians. They were our kinsmen, men with whom we shared a common language, a common culture, a common history. We had trained in the same dojos, we had read the same poets. We had sworn allegiance to the same code of Bushido, and now we were killing each other with a brutal and impersonal efficiency. It was a national tragedy of epic proportions, a self-inflicted wound from which we might never fully recover. The nature of the warfare itself was a bizarre and unsettling hybrid of the old and the new. It was like a very disorganized, very deadly costume party. Everyone's confused in the same battle. You would see a samurai in full ornate armor charging forward with his ancestral katana, only to be cut down by a peasant conscript armed with a breech-loading rifle. You would see lines of infantry, drilled in the Prussian style, firing disciplined volleys, while elsewhere on the field a cavalry charge of horsemen with spears was being blown to pieces by modern artillery. It was a chaotic and surreal spectacle. A war that was being fought in two different centuries at the same time. The opening battle at Toba-Fushimi, just south of the imperial capital of Kyoto, set the tone for the entire conflict. The shogunate forces, though superior in number, were a disorganized mess. They were confident that their traditional samurai spirit would carry the day. The imperial army, on the other hand, was a well-oiled machine. They had cannons, they had rifles, and they had a unified command structure. But the result was a rout. The shogunate's forces were shattered, their confidence broken, their path to Kyoto blocked. The dream of a swift victory for the Tokugawa was dead on arrival. The war then moved east as the imperial army marched on the shogun's capital of Edo. The city was surrendered without a fight, a pragmatic decision by the shogunate's leaders that saved countless lives, but was seen by many of their more zealous followers as a profound betrayal. The shogun himself was placed under house arrest, his power and prestige shattered. But the war was far from over. The loyalist domains of the north, led by the powerful Aizu clan, refused to surrender. They formed a northern alliance and vowed to fight on, to defend their honor and their way of life to the last man. The siege of Eizu Wakamatsu Castle became one of the most iconic and tragic episodes of the war. The Eizu clan were renowned for their martial prowess and their unwavering loyalty to the Tokugawa. They were the embodiment of the old samurai spirit, and they were determined to make a final, glorious stand. For a month they held out against the overwhelming firepower of the imperial army. The defenders, including women and children, fought with a desperate courage that earned them the grudging respect of their enemies. Inside the besieged castle, the scenes were a heartbreaking mix of heroism and horror. The women formed firefighting brigades, they tended to the wounded, and some even took up arms themselves. The Byakutai, the White Tiger Unit, a group of teenage samurai, famously committed seppuku on a nearby hillside when they mistakenly believed that the castle had fallen. It was a story of tragic devotion, a testament to the power of a code that demanded loyalty unto death. But it was also a story of a needless and terrible waste of young life. In the end, Aizu fell. The castle was battered into submission by relentless cannon fire. The defenders slaughtered, the city put to the torch. It was a brutal and definitive statement from the new government. The old ways were dead, and any who clung to them would be crushed. The fall of Aizu broke the back of the Northern Alliance, but it also left a legacy of bitterness and resentment that would linger for generations. The final act of the Boshin War was played out on the northern island of Hokkaido, then known as Ezo. A group of die-hard Tokugawa loyalists, led by the naval commander Enomoto Takayuki, escaped to the island and established the Republic of Ezo, the first and only republic ever to be declared on Japanese soil. It was a short-lived and quixotic experiment, a last desperate attempt to create a sanctuary for the samurai way of life. They even had elections, a bizarre and foreign concept that they had presumably picked up from their Western advisors. The Republic of Ezo was a strange and fascinating place, a sort of samurai pirate kingdom at the edge of the world. It was a mix of feudal Japanese traditions and modern Western technology. The French military advisors who had sided with the shogunate were there, helping to train the army and design the fortifications. The great swordsman and former leader of the Shinsengumi, Hijikata Toshizo, was there, fighting his last battles with a mixture of cold steel and modern tactics. It was a doomed enterprise, but it was a magnificent failure. The imperial forces, of course, could not let this challenge to their authority stand. They sent a large expeditionary force to Hokkaido, and in the spring of 1869 the final battle of the Boshin War was fought at Hakodate. It was a battle of ironclad warships and coastal forts, a thoroughly modern affair that signaled the final triumph of the new way of war. Hijikata was killed, shot off his horse while leading a charge. Enomoto, a more pragmatic man, surrendered. The Republic of Ezo was no more. The war was over. And so the emperor was restored, the nation was unified, and the long, bloody process of building a new Japan could begin. But the cost had been immense. We had torn our country apart, we had slaughtered our own people, we had trampled on the very traditions we claimed to be fighting for. The Boshin War was not a glorious victory for anyone. It was a national trauma, a brutal and necessary surgery that had left deep and lasting scars. Don't let the memory of our tragic civil war, this deadly and confusing costume party, fade into the static of history. You have a duty to bear witness, Hit that subscribe button now. Ensure that the voices of the men who fought and died on both sides of this conflict are not forgotten. Your subscription is a memorial to the fallen, a testament to the brutal and absurd tragedy of a nation at war with itself. Do not hesitate, act now. The aftermath of the war was a time of reckoning. The victorious imperial government showed a surprising degree of clemency to many of the former shogunate leaders. Men like Enomoto Takeaki, who had led the final rebellion, were pardoned and given positions in the new government. It was a pragmatic move, a recognition that the new Japan needed the skills and expertise of all its people, regardless of which side they had fought on. But for the rank-and-file samurai of the defeated northern domains, the future was bleak. They were stripped of their lands, their status, and their stipends. They were treated with suspicion and contempt by the new regime. They were the losers, the relics of a failed system, and they were made to pay the price for their loyalty to the old ways. Many of them fell into poverty, forced to take up menial jobs to survive. It was a humiliating end for a class of men who had once been the proud rulers of Japan. The Boshin War was a watershed moment in our history. It was the violent and bloody birth of modern Japan. It was a war that was fought over competing visions of the future, a war that pitted tradition against progress, the sword against the gun. In the end, progress won, as it always does, but the victory was a hollow one for those of us who had lived through the conflict. We had seen too much, we had lost too much, to celebrate the outcome. The confusion of the battlefield was a perfect reflection of the confusion in our own hearts. We were fighting for causes that we only half understood, against enemies who looked just like us. We were clinging to a code of honor that seemed increasingly out of place in a world of industrial-scale slaughter. We were caught between the past and the future, and the present was a bloody and chaotic mess. The irony of it all was that both sides believed they were fighting for the good of the nation. The imperial loyalists believed that they were saving Japan from the weakness of the shogunate and the threat of foreign domination. The Tokugawa loyalists believed that they were preserving the stability and order that had given us 2.5 centuries of peace. They were both right, and they were both wrong, and in the clash of their competing visions, they almost destroyed the very thing they were trying to save. The war also revealed the deep and bitter regional rivalries that had long simmered beneath the surface of our unified nation. The resentment of the western domains of Satsuma and Choshu towards the Tokugawa was a major driving force behind the conflict. The war was not just an ideological struggle, it was a settling of old scores, a chance for the perennial outsiders to finally seize the center of power. For the common soldier, the foot soldier who bore the brunt of the fighting, the war was a terrifying and bewildering experience. They were often ill-equipped, ill-fed, and led by officers who were still trying to figure out how to fight a modern war. They died in droves, their bodies left to rot on the battlefields, their names forgotten by history. They were the true victims of the Boshin War, the pawns in a game being played by men far grander and more ambitious than themselves. The weapons themselves were a source of constant confusion and terror. A samurai might enter a battle expecting a traditional fight, only to find himself facing a Gatling gun. A peasant conscript might be handed a rifle he barely knew how to use and told to stand his ground against a charge of enraged sword-wielding warriors. It was a war of mismatched technologies and mismatched expectations, and the result was a level of carnage that we had not seen in centuries. The end of the Boshin War did not bring an end to the violence. The new government faced a series of samurai rebellions in the years that followed, as disaffected warriors protested against the loss of their status and privileges. The new Japan was born in violence, and it would take many more years for the wounds to heal and for a new sense of national unity to emerge. And so, the broadcast continues, a ghost voice from a ghost war. We were a nation that had lost its way, a people who had turned their swords on themselves. The Boshin War was the price we paid for our entry into the modern world, a price paid in blood and tears and shattered honor. It was a lesson we would not soon forget. Just when we thought our situation could not possibly become more absurd, the foreigners decided to get involved. Not content with selling us the weapons to conduct our little national dispute, they felt it was their solemn duty to teach us how to use them properly. It was a stunning display of condescension, a final, galling twist of the knife in the heart of our national pride. We, the descendants of the most formidable warriors in the history of this land, were now being tutored in the art of war by men who smelled of cheese and wore trousers that were far too tight. The age of the samurai had officially descended into farce. The Shogunate, in its infinite and rapidly diminishing wisdom, decided to place its faith in the French. A full-blown military mission arrived from Paris, led by a man named Shogunate and later the rather more famous Jules Brunet. They were impeccably dressed, they oozed a sort of languid, world-weary charm, and they were here to whip our motley collection of samurai and peasant conscripts into a fighting force that Napoleon III himself would be proud of. They brought with them schematics for modern forts. They taught us the finer points of artillery triangulation, and they introduced us to the concept of the organized, disciplined, and utterly soul-crushing drills of a modern army. On the other side, our imperial rivals, the enlightened modernizers of Satsuma and Choshu, sought the counsel of the British. The English, ever the pragmatists, were less interested in the parade ground perfection of our formations and more concerned with the practical business of winning a war. Their involvement was less formal, more a matter of quiet advice, naval expertise, and ensuring that their preferred side had access to the best and most reliable weaponry. They were a nation of shopkeepers, as the French were fond of saying, and they knew a good investment when they saw one. The future of Japan, it seemed, was being decided by a European rivalry played out by Japanese proxies. The absurdity of the situation was lost on no one, least of all us samurai who were forced to endure the instruction of these uninvited sensei. Imagine, if you will, a master swordsman, a man who has dedicated his life to the pursuit of martial perfection, being taught how to hold a rifle by a fresh-faced lieutenant from Lyons who has probably never seen a real battle in his life. The Frenchman would patiently explain the mechanics of the weapon, the importance of keeping it clean, the correct posture for firing. The samurai would nod politely, his mind a raging torrent of indignation, his hand itching for the feel of his sword hilt. It was a masterclass in cultural misunderstanding. So, a Frenchman taught us how to point a noisy stick, and an Englishman taught the other side. Very helpful. They probably thought it was quaint. Look at the little Japanese warriors, they must have thought, so eager to learn our superior ways. They saw us as children playing with dangerous toys, as exotic curiosities to be studied and molded in their own image. They did not understand our history, our culture, or the profound and tragic nature of the conflict they were so eagerly participating in. They were simply military contractors, plying their trade in a foreign land, blissfully unaware of the existential crisis they were helping to orchestrate. The French advisors, with their love of theory and grand strategy, tried to turn our army into a replica of their own. They created units with grand-sounding names like the Denshutai, an elite corps of infantry drilled in the French style. They were magnificent on the parade ground, their movements precise, their uniforms immaculate. They were also, for the most part, completely unsuited to the realities of warfare in Japan. The neat, orderly lines of European battlefields were a far cry from the mountainous terrain and chaotic skirmishes that defined our civil war. The French were teaching us how to win the last war, while we were busy losing the current one. The British, with their more hands-on approach, were arguably more effective. Their advisors, often naval officers or enterprising merchants, understood the importance of sea power. They helped the imperial forces to build a modern navy, to master the art of the coastal bombardment, and to transport their troops quickly and efficiently. It was a less glamorous but far more practical form of assistance. While the French were teaching us how to march in straight lines, the British were teaching our enemies how to control the seas and cut off our supply lines. It was a lesson in the difference between style and substance. The interactions between the samurai and their foreign tutors were a constant source of dark amusement. The language barrier was, of course, a major obstacle. We would communicate through a mixture of pidgin Japanese, broken English or French, and a great deal of frustrated gesturing. A simple command to fix bayonets could easily be misinterpreted as an invitation to a tea ceremony. The potential for fatal misunderstandings was ever present, adding a frisson of mortal danger to our daily lessons. The cultural gap was even wider. The The French, for instance, could not understand our obsession with honor. They could not grasp why a samurai would rather die in a hopeless charge than surrender to a superior force. C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre, one of them famously said of a particularly brave but suicidal attack. It is magnificent, but it is not war. For us, it was the only kind of war we knew how to fight. For them, it was just bad tactics. The British, on the other hand, were often bemused by our lack of commercial acumen. They could not understand why we were so willing to pay exorbitant prices for their weapons, why we were so trusting of their promises. They were hard-nosed businessmen, and they were dealing with a class of men who had been taught to despise commerce. It was a marriage made in heaven for the arms dealers of Manchester and Liverpool. For the foreign advisers themselves, Japan was a strange and exotic adventure. They wrote letters home, filled with tales of our bizarre customs, our beautiful women, our incomprehensible code of honor. They saw themselves as adventurers, as pioneers bringing the light of Western civilization to a benighted and backward land. Some of them, like Jules Brunet, even went native, developing a genuine affection for our culture and a deep loyalty to the cause they had been sent to support. Shogunate famously resigned his commission in the French army to fight alongside the remnants of the Shogunate's forces in their final hopeless stand at Hakodate. It was a romantic, if ultimately futile, gesture. But for every brunette, there were a dozen others who saw us as little more than a stepping stone in their own careers, a chance to gain some practical experience before returning to the more serious business of fighting other Europeans. They were a necessary evil, a tool to be used and then discarded. We learned what we could from them, we took their weapons and their training, but we never fully trusted them. They were, after all, barbarians. The presence of these foreign experts had a corrosive effect on the morale of many samurai. It was a constant, visible reminder of our own inadequacy. We had been forced to admit that our own martial traditions were no longer sufficient, that we had to turn to outsiders to learn how to defend ourselves. It was a profound humiliation, another nail in the coffin of our self-respect. We were becoming strangers in our own land, our destiny being shaped by men who did not share our values or understand our souls. If you are still listening to this broadcast, and not currently being drilled in the art of bayonet fighting by a man named Pierre, then you are one of us. You understand the profound and tragic absurdity of our situation. To show your solidarity, to prove that you are not in the pocket of some foreign consultant, subscribe to our channel. It is a small act of defiance, a way of saying that you still believe in the wisdom of our own ways, even as we are being forced to abandon them. Do it now before they make us all wear silly hats. The irony, of course, was that we were learning to kill each other more efficiently. The French taught the Shogunate forces how to build stronger fortifications, and the British taught the imperial forces how to blow them up with bigger cannons. The French taught us how to form a disciplined infantry square, and the British taught our enemies how to break it with a well-timed cavalry charge. It was a deadly and elaborate game of chess, with Japanese samurai as the pawns and foreign advisors as the players. The battlefield became a laboratory for foreign military theories. The French and the British could test their latest weapons and tactics on us without having to risk the lives of their own soldiers. We were the guinea pigs in their grand experiment, and the Boshin War was their clinical trial. The results, which were published in the casualty lists of our own newspapers, were presumably of great interest to the military academies of Europe. This foreign intervention also had the unintended consequence of prolonging the war. Without the expert advice and modern weaponry provided by their Western patrons, it is possible that the conflict would have been resolved much more quickly. But the foreigners had a vested interest in keeping the war going, as long as their side was winning. A protracted conflict meant more arms sales, more influence, and a greater say in the future of our nation. The ordinary samurai was caught in the middle of this geopolitical game. One day he would be learning how to load a French chassepot rifle, the next he would be facing a British Armstrong gun. He was being asked to assimilate a century of European military innovation in a matter of months, all while fighting for his life in a brutal civil war. The mental and physical strain was immense. The presence of these foreigners also created a new kind of tension within our own ranks. There were those who embraced the new ways, who eagerly soaked up the knowledge of their foreign tutors. They were the pragmatists, the ones who understood that survival depended on adaptation. And then there were the traditionalists, the ones who resisted the changes, who saw the foreign advisors as a corrupting influence. This created a new fault line in our already fractured society, another source of suspicion and distrust. And what did the foreigners truly think of us? Their diaries and letters reveal a strange mixture of admiration and contempt. They admired our courage, our stoicism, our almost suicidal devotion to honor, but they also saw us as naive, as technologically backward, as a people who were trapped in the past. They saw our civil war as a quaint and rather bloody historical reenactment, not as the life-and-death struggle for the soul of a nation that it truly was. Some of the advisors, particularly the French who stuck with the shogunate to the bitter end, became deeply embroiled in the conflict. They were no longer just advisors, they were combatants. They fought and died alongside their Japanese comrades, their fates intertwined with the lost cause of the Tokugawa. Their story is a strange and often overlooked chapter in the history of the Boshin War, a tale of misplaced loyalty and romantic idealism. But for the most part, the foreign advisors were a transient and self-interested presence. They were a symptom of our weakness, a visible sign of our dependence on the very powers we had once sought to expel. They were a necessary evil, perhaps, but they were an evil nonetheless. They may have taught us how to fight a modern war, but they also taught us a deeper and more painful lesson, that in the new world order, the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. The legacy of these uninvited sensei is a complex one. They helped to modernize our military, they introduced us to new technologies and new ways of thinking, and they undoubtedly played a role in shaping the outcome of the Boshin War. But they also deepened our national sense of humiliation, they fueled our civil war, and they turned our country into a playground for their own imperial rivalries. They were both a catalyst for change and a source of profound corruption. The image of a French officer trying to teach a samurai how to salute is one that will forever be etched in my memory. It is an image that perfectly captures the absurdity, the tragedy, and the dark humor of our situation. We were a nation at a crossroads, a people caught between two worlds, and the foreigners were the bewildered and often unhelpful traffic cops who were trying to direct the flow. And so, we learned our lessons. We learned how to kill more efficiently. We learned how to fight like the barbarians. We learned how to play their game. But in the process, we lost something of ourselves. We lost the simple, elegant clarity of our old ways. We lost the sense of honor that came from a battle fought on equal terms. We lost our innocence. And that perhaps was the most painful lesson of all. Of all the seismic shocks that rattled the foundations of our world, none was more profoundly unsettling than the sight of a farmer holding a rifle. For centuries, the order of our society had been as clear and unchangeable as the heavens. We, the samurai, were at the top. Beneath us were the farmers, the artisans, and finally the merchants. Each class had its place, its duties, its divinely ordained role. Our role, our entire reason for being, was the monopoly on violence. The sword was our symbol, our privilege, our burden. The peasants tilled the soil, the artisans crafted their wares, and we fought the wars. It was a neat, orderly system that had worked for generations. Then came the Boshin War, and the neat, orderly system was thrown onto a bonfire. The idea first took root in the rebellious domain of Choshu, a place that had always been a hotbed of radical thinking. A man named Takasugi Shinsaku, a rather brilliant and consumptive young samurai, decided that the old rules of warfare no longer applied. He argued that in the age of the gun, a man's birth was less important than his ability to shoot straight. And so he created the Kihite, the irregular unit, a militia made up of men from all social classes. Samurai, farmers, merchants, even sumo wrestlers and monks. It was a revolutionary, almost heretical idea. It was also, as it turned out, terrifyingly effective. At first we scoffed. The notion of arming peasants was laughable. What would a farmer know of war? His hands were made for the plough, not the rifle. His mind was consumed with thoughts of rice paddies and rainfall, not strategy and tactics. We were convinced that their lack of breeding, their absence of a martial spirit, would make them useless on the battlefield. We believed that a single well-born samurai, imbued with the spirit of Bushido, could easily defeat a dozen of these mud-stained conscripts. It was a comforting belief, one that allowed us to sleep at night. It was also, as we would soon discover, dangerously wrong. The farmers, bless their rice-growing hearts, now have rifles, and they're surprisingly good at using them. It turns out that years of disciplined, back-breaking labor in the fields gives a man a certain steady resolve. It also turns out that you don't need a noble lineage to learn how to load, aim, and fire a rifle. The Kihaitai and other units like them proved this time and time again. They were not as graceful as we were, perhaps. They lacked our poetic sensibilities, our appreciation for the finer points of ritual suicide. But they could fight. They could stand in a line, they could follow orders, and they could unleash a devastating volley of fire that could tear through a traditional samurai charge like a typhoon through a paper screen. The psychological impact of this development cannot be overstated. It was one thing to be defeated by a rival samurai clan. That was a part of the natural order of things, a game we had been playing for centuries. It was another thing entirely to be defeated by a man you would not have deigned to speak to a year earlier. It was a humiliation of the highest order, a social inversion so profound that it made our heads spin. My ancestors are spinning in their graves, probably very fast. The very foundations of our identity, our sense of superiority, were being blasted away by the rifle fire of commoners. The new imperial government, having seen the effectiveness of these mixed-class units, was quick to adopt the model on a national scale. In 1873 they issued a nationwide conscription law, a decree that required every able-bodied male, regardless of his social standing, to serve a term in the new imperial army. It was the final, definitive nail in the coffin of the samurai class. The defense of the nation was no longer our exclusive privilege, it was now the duty of every citizen. We had been made redundant. The sight of our local blacksmith's son, a boy we had watched grow up covered in soot and grime, now marching down the street in a smart new Western-style uniform, a rifle on his shoulder, was a sight that filled us with a strange mixture of rage and despair. It was a visual representation of our own obsolescence. The skills that we had spent our lives perfecting, the martial arts that had been passed down through our families for generations, were now less valuable than a commoner's ability to follow orders and pull a trigger. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The new army was a strange and alien creature. It was drilled by foreign advisors, it fought with foreign weapons, and it was made up of men who would have been flogged for even touching a sword a decade earlier. The old hierarchies were gone, replaced by a new meritocracy based on rank and skill, not birth. A talented peasant could now rise to become an officer, commanding men of samurai stock. The world had been turned upside down. This new reality forced a painful re-evaluation of everything we believed in. We had always assumed that our martial prowess was a product of our superior breeding, our innate spiritual refinement. The success of the commoner armies suggested a much more prosaic truth, that any man given the right training and the right weapon could be turned into an effective soldier. It was a deeply unsettling, almost democratic idea, and we hated it. Of course, we found ways to mock them. We called them the blood-tax soldiers. We made fun of their clumsy attempts to imitate Western drill. We sneered at their lack of refinement. But beneath the mockery, there was a current of fear. We knew that these peasant armies were the future, and that, in that future, there was no place for us. We were the dinosaurs, watching as the furry little mammals scurried about our feet, blissfully unaware that the meteor was already on its way. The irony was that we, the samurai, had been the ones who had started this whole mess. We were the ones who had agitated for the overthrow of the Shogunate, who had rallied to the cause of the emperor. We had done so in the hope of restoring our own fortunes, of reasserting our own primacy in Japanese society. Instead, we had unleashed a revolution that was now consuming its own creators. We had sown the wind, and we were now reaping the whirlwind. The new government was not sentimental. They saw the samurai class not as the saviors of the nation, but as an expensive and potentially troublesome anachronism. They began to systematically dismantle our privileges. They took away our stipends, they abolished our domains, and finally, they took away our swords. The very symbol of our identity, the soul of the samurai, was now a forbidden object. We had been disarmed, disenfranchised, and discarded. The response of the samurai class to this existential crisis was varied. Some, as I have mentioned, chose rebellion, a last, desperate, and futile attempt to turn back the clock. Others chose adaptation. They cut off their top knots, they put on Western suits, they went into business or politics or the new civil service. They swallowed their pride and found a new way to serve the nation. They were the survivors, the ones who understood that the game had changed and that the old rules no longer applied. If you are a supporter of this new and deeply unsettling social order, if you believe that a man's worth is not determined by his birth but by his ability to handle a rifle, then I suppose you should subscribe. It is the modern thing to do, after all. Show your support for the rise of the common man and the decline of the hereditary warrior. Click the button. The blacksmith's son would want you to. The rise of the commoner soldier was not just a military revolution. It was a social one. It challenged the very idea of a natural aristocracy, the notion that some men are born to rule and others are born to serve. It was a profoundly disruptive force, one that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of our nation. It was the beginning of the end of feudal Japan. The new army, for all its flaws and its lack of samurai refinement, had one great advantage. It was loyal to the state, not to a particular domain or a particular lord. The peasant conscript owed his allegiance to the emperor and the nation, not to a local daimyo. This was a crucial step in the creation of a modern, centralized nation-state. The new army was not just a tool for fighting wars, it was a tool for building a new national identity. For us, the samurai, this was perhaps the most bitter irony of all. We, who had for so long been the guardians of our local domains, were now being replaced by an army of commoners who had no connection to the land they were defending. Their loyalty was an abstract one, a loyalty to a concept called Japan that was still in the process of being invented. Our loyalty, by contrast, had always been a personal one, a bond of honor between a warrior and his lord. It was a bond that the new Japan had no use for. The peasant soldier was also, it must be said, a more reliable and cost-sufficient instrument of state power. He did not have our expensive stipends, our troublesome sense of honor, our inconvenient habit of questioning orders that we found to be dishonorable. He was a blank slate, a piece of clay that could be molded to suit the needs of his new masters. He was, in short, the perfect soldier for the modern age. The sight of these new armies on the march was a sobering one. They moved with a disciplined, almost mechanical efficiency. They were a sea of identical uniforms, a forest of identical rifles. The vibrant, chaotic color of the old samurai armies, with their elaborate armor and their personal banners, was gone, replaced by a drab and monotonous uniformity. It was the visual representation of a new kind of power, a power that was based not on individual heroism, but on collective discipline and industrial-scale firepower. We watched them from the sidelines, we the dispossessed, we the obsolete. We saw them go off to fight the government's wars, to suppress the rebellions of our own samurai brethren. We saw them become the new guardians of the nation, the new enforcers of the peace, and we knew, with a certainty that chilled us to the bone, that our time was over. The farmers had won, not through a peasant uprising, not through a violent revolution from below, but through a revolution that had been imposed from above. They had been handed the tools of their own empowerment by the very men who were trying to create a new and more powerful state. It was a strange and paradoxical turn of events, one that none of us could have predicted. The legacy of the commoner soldier is still with us today. It is the foundation of the modern Japanese military. It is the basis of our modern sense of national identity. The idea that every citizen has a duty to defend the nation, an idea that was once so radical and so offensive to our sensibilities, is now a commonplace. The farmers with rifles did more than just win a war. They remade a nation. And so we fade into the background, we the men of the sword. Our story becomes a historical curiosity, a romantic tale of a bygone era. We are remembered in plays and in poems. Our armor and our swords are displayed in museums. But our world, The world where a man's worth was measured by his honor and his skill with a blade is gone forever. The future belongs to the common man, and to the gun that made him the equal of his former master. This broadcast is a final, fading echo from that lost world. It is a testament to the shock and the sorrow of a class of men who woke up one day to find that they were no longer relevant. It is a story of a social order that was not just overthrown, but rendered completely and utterly obsolete. The world kept spinning, and it left us behind. The farmers went from tilling the soil to tilling the battlefields, and we, the warriors, were left with nothing but our memories and our useless, beautiful swords. It is a strange and ironic fate, but it is our fate nonetheless. The broadcast is ending. The signal is weak. The ghosts of the past are calling Edo. The shogun's capital. For centuries it was the heart of our world, a sprawling city of wood and paper, of quiet temples and bustling marketplaces. It was a city of canals and bridges, of cherry trees and the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke. It was a city of order, where the grand mansions of the daimyo stood in silent testament to the power of the Tokugawa, and the common folk lived their lives according to the rhythm of the seasons. It was our home, and now it is becoming a place we no longer recognize. The transformation began subtly. A new kind of building would appear, a strange, box-like structure made of brick and stone, squatting uncomfortably amongst the graceful lines of our traditional wooden houses. They called it Western Style, a term that was meant to denote progress, but to us sounded like a disease. These buildings were cold, they were ugly, and they had a disconcerting habit of not burning down with the same pleasing regularity as our own. They were the architectural equivalent of the foreigners who designed them, solid, graceless, and stubbornly permanent. Then came the new smells. Our beautiful city, once tranquil, now it smells of gunpowder and cheap tobacco. And horses, but that's always been the case. Still, progress, they say. The delicate scent of incense from the temples, the earthy smell of the fish market, the sweet fragrance of plum blossoms in the spring. These were the aromas of our youth. They are now being overpowered by the acrid stench of coal smoke from the new steamships in the bay, the cloying sweetness of the Western Style bakeries, and the unfamiliar and frankly unpleasant odor of foreign bodies packed too tightly together in their woolen clothes. The sounds, too, have changed. The gentle clip-clop of wooden sandals on the pavement, the rhythmic chant of the street vendors, the distant toll of a temple bell. These were the sounds that once lulled us to sleep. Now we are assailed by a cacophony of new and terrifying noises, the shrill whistle of a steam train, the clanging of construction on some new government ministry, the drunken shouting of foreign sailors on leave. The quiet, contemplative spaces of our city are shrinking, replaced by a relentless and exhausting din. The streets themselves have become a stage for this cultural clash. A samurai in his traditional silk kimono and topknot might find himself walking alongside a Japanese merchant in a poorly fitting Western suit, a bowler hat perched precariously on his head. It is a sight that is both comical and deeply depressing. We, who were once the undisputed masters of this city, now find ourselves sharing it with a new class of men who are eager to shed their own culture in a desperate attempt to imitate the barbarians. And the foreigners? They are everywhere. They have their own designated quarter, of course, a sort of gilded cage where they can live their strange and incomprehensible lives. But they do not stay there. They roam our city with an air of confident ownership. Their loud voices and their even louder manners, a constant source of irritation. They stare at our temples as if they were tourist attractions. They haggle in our markets with a boorish lack of decorum. And they treat our women with a familiarity that makes our blood run cold. They are a constant, walking, talking reminder of our own diminished status. The city's name itself has been changed. Edo, the Bay Door, the name that has been synonymous with the power of the shogunate for over 250 years, is no more. It is now Tokyo, the eastern capital, the new home of the restored emperor. It is a symbolic act, a declaration that the old era is over and a new name has begun. But for those of us who grew up in the city of Edo, the new name feels like a betrayal, an erasure of our own history. The transformation has brought with it a new kind of fear. The old fears were familiar ones, the fear of a fire, the fear of a bad harvest, the fear of offending a superior. The new fears are more insidious, more amorphous. It is the fear of the unknown, the fear of a future that is being shaped by forces we do not understand and cannot control. It is the fear of losing our identity, of becoming a pale imitation of the West. It is the fear of waking up one day and finding that our city, our culture, our very souls have been sold to the highest bidder. The new government is obsessed with civilization and enlightenment, a slogan they have borrowed from the West. They are determined to turn Tokyo into a modern, world-class city, a rival to London or Paris. They are tearing down the old daimyo mansions to make way for new government ministries. They are filling in the canals to build wider roads. They are planning to install gas lamps to replace our beautiful paper lanterns. They call it progress. We call it vandalism. The old social geography of the city is being erased. The clear lines that once separated the samurai quarters from the merchant districts, the temples from the entertainment quarters, are becoming blurred. The city is becoming a chaotic jumble of the old and the new, a place where a traditional noodle shop can stand next to a Western-style beef eatery, where a Shinto shrine can be overshadowed by a Christian church. It is a city that is losing its sense of coherence, its sense of self. The change is not just happening on the outside, it is seeping into the very fabric of our daily lives. People are starting to adopt Western customs with a desperate and often comical eagerness. They are eating with forks and knives, they are shaking hands instead of bowing, they are drinking foul-tasting concoctions called beer and wine. They are embracing the new with a faddish intensity, as if they believe that by simply adopting the habits of the foreigners, they can somehow acquire their power. For us, the samurai, the transformation of the city is a particularly bitter pill to swallow. This was our city. We were the ones who patrolled its streets, who maintained its peace, who gave it its character. Now, we are becoming ghosts in our own home. We walk through the new, unfamiliar streets, and we feel a sense of profound alienation. The city is no longer ours. It belongs to the merchants, to the bureaucrats, to the foreigners. It belongs to the future, and the future has no place for us. If you are enjoying this chaotic and often bewildering tour of a city in the midst of a nervous breakdown, if you find a strange beauty in this clash of cultures, then please subscribe. Do not let this broadcast, this last fading echo of a lost city, disappear into the noise of progress. Your subscription is a vote for preservation, a small act of defiance against the relentless march of the new. Click the button before they tear down the broadcast tower to build a clock. The pace of change is dizzying. One day a familiar landmark is there, the next it is gone, replaced by a hole in the ground and a sign promising some new and glorious addition to the modern city. The old tea houses, where we once gathered to compose poetry and discuss politics, are being turned into beer halls and billiard parlors. The quiet gardens where we once sought refuge from the cares of the world are being paved over to make way for new roads. The city is losing its memory, and we, its former guardians, are the only ones who seem to notice or to care. There is a sense of frantic, almost manic energy in the air. Everyone is in a hurry. Everyone is chasing some new dream of wealth or power. The old, slow, deliberate pace of life has been replaced by a frenetic and exhausting race. The city is a whirlwind of ambition, a place where fortunes are being made and lost in the blink of an eye. It is an exciting time for some, no doubt, but for those of us who value tranquility and order, it is a living nightmare. The new technologies are both fascinating and terrifying. The telegraph, which allows messages to be sent across vast distances in an instant, is a marvel of ingenuity. It is also a tool that allows the new government to extend its control into the furthest corners of the land, to crush dissent before it can even take root. The steam train, which can transport men and materiel with unprecedented speed, is a symbol of our new industrial might. It is also a scar on the landscape, a noisy, smoke-belching serpent that devours the countryside. The visual pollution is almost as bad as the noise and the smell. The new buildings are adorned with garish signs in foreign scripts, advertising products we have never heard of and do not need. The newspapers, a new and insidious form of gossip, are filled with crude woodblock prints depicting the latest political scandals or the most fashionable Western attire. The simple, understated beauty of our traditional aesthetic is being buried under an avalanche of visual clutter. The change has even reached our food. The simple, healthy diet of rice, fish, and vegetables that has sustained us for centuries is now being supplemented and in some cases replaced by the heavy, greasy food of the West. The beef eateries are particularly popular, as people have been convinced that eating the flesh of four-legged animals will make them as strong and aggressive as the barbarian. It is a dubious proposition, and one that has had the unfortunate side effect of making the city smell like a slaughterhouse. The old sense of community is breaking down. In the past, we knew our neighbors. We lived in close-knit communities bound together by ties of kinship and obligation. The new city is an anonymous place, a collection of strangers. People move in and out with bewildering speed, chasing jobs and opportunities. The old bonds of loyalty and trust are being replaced by the cold, impersonal logic of the marketplace. The fear and uncertainty are palpable. We do not know what tomorrow will bring. We do not know what new decree the government will issue, what new custom we will be expected to adopt, what new piece of our world will be swept away. We live in a constant state of low-grade anxiety, a feeling that the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet. For a warrior class that was raised on a creed of stoicism and self-control, this new emotional landscape is a difficult one to navigate. We are not accustomed to feeling helpless, to feeling like victims of circumstance. We are accustomed to being in control, to shaping our own destiny. But our destiny is no longer in our own hands. It is being shaped by forces that are far beyond our control, and the sense of impotence that this engenders is a corrosive and deeply dishonorable feeling. And yet life goes on. Babies are born, people fall in love, the cherry blossoms still bloom in the spring. Amidst the chaos and the confusion, there are moments of beauty and grace. A snatch of a traditional song heard in a back alley, the sight of a child flying a kite in a crowded park, the quiet dignity of an old samurai walking through the new city with his head held high. These are the moments that give us hope, the moments that remind us that not all is lost. But the tide of history is a powerful one, and it is flowing in only one direction. The city of Edo, the city of our memories, is dying. A new city, the city of Tokyo, is being born. And we, the last of the samurai, are left to wander its streets, ghosts in a city that has forgotten our name. We are the living embodiment of the cultural clash that is tearing our nation apart, and our only solace is in the telling of our story. This broadcast is our final act of remembrance, our last attempt to capture the spirit of a city before it disappears forever. It is a love letter to a place that no longer exists, a lament for a world that has been lost. The transformation is relentless, the future is uncertain, and the only thing we can do is bear witness. The signal is fading, drowned out by the noise of progress. The city is calling, but it is a call we no longer understand. As the new imperial government tightened its grip on the nation, a strange and fatalistic mood settled over the remaining pockets of resistance. The war was lost, we all knew it, in our hearts, if not in our words. The shogun had surrendered, Edo had fallen, and the great domains of the south and west had bent the knee to the emperor. And yet, some of us refused to accept the inevitable. Call it honor, call it stubbornness, call it a collective death wish. Whatever the reason, there were those who decided that if the age of the samurai was to end, it would end not with a whimper, but with a bang, a very loud, very bloody, and ultimately very futile bang. The first and most legendary of these last stands took place in the rugged northern domain of Aizu. The samurai of Aizu were renowned throughout Japan for their martial prowess and their unwavering, almost fanatical loyalty to the Tokugawa clan. They were the keepers of the old ways, a bastion of traditional samurai values in a world that was rapidly losing its mind. When the new government demanded their surrender, they responded with a quiet and resolute defiance. They would fight, they would die, but they would not submit. The siege of Aizu Wakamatsu Castle in the autumn of 1868 was a tragedy of almost poetic proportions. It was a medieval castle, defended by warriors armed with swords and spears and an unshakable belief in their own righteousness, pitted against a modern army equipped with artillery that could reduce their walls to rubble from a safe distance. It was not a fair fight. It was not meant to be a fair fight. It was a lesson, a brutal and public demonstration of the power of the new regime. Inside the castle, the defenders faced the inevitable with a grim and stoic resolve. The women formed firefighting brigades and tended to the wounded. The children carried messages and supplies. The samurai, outnumbered and outgunned, mounted desperate counterattacks, their swords flashing in the firelight, their war cries drowned out by the thunder of the cannons. It was a scene from a bygone era, a final glorious tableau of the samurai way of war. And then there were the Byakutai, the White Tiger unit, a group of several hundred teenage samurai, some as young as 16. They were the flower of Aizu's youth, and they were determined to die for their lord. When they saw smoke rising from the direction of the castle, they mistakenly believed that it had fallen. From a nearby hillside they looked down upon what they thought was the ruin of their home, and one by one they committed seppuku. It was an act of heartbreaking and ultimately pointless devotion, a symbol of a generation that had been sacrificed on the altar of a lost cause. Some of us still charge with swords. It's less effective, more symbolic. A very bloody, very definitive kind of symbolism. The men of Aizu knew they could not win. But winning was no longer the point. The point was to show the world how a samurai was supposed to die. The point was to make a statement, to etch their defiance into the pages of history. In that, at least, they succeeded. In the end, after a month of relentless bombardment, the castle fell. The survivors were rounded up, the city was burned, and the domain of Aizu was dissolved. It was a brutal and total defeat, but it was also a moral victory of a kind. The story of Aizu became a legend, a cautionary tale about the price of defiance, but also a testament to the enduring power of loyalty and honor. They lost the battle, but they won the argument about how to die well. But the spirit of resistance was not yet entirely extinguished. A small and determined band of Tokugawa loyalists, led by the naval commander Enomoto Takayuki, managed to escape the mainland. They sailed north to the untamed and sparsely populated island of Ezo, which we now call Hokkaido. There, on the frozen frontier of our nation, they made their last defiant stand. They declared the founding of the Republic of Izu, a bizarre and wonderful experiment in samurai self-government. They had a president, they had a cabinet, they even had elections. It was a strange fusion of feudal Japanese ideals and Western republicanism, a last desperate attempt to create a world where a samurai could still be a samurai. They were joined by a handful of French military advisors, romantic idealists who had chosen to throw in their lot with the lost cause of the Shogunate. The Republic of Ezo was a beautiful and hopeless dream. It was a pirate kingdom at the end of the world, a final refuge for the dispossessed and the defiant. For a few brief months, they created a society on their own terms, a place where the old virtues of loyalty and honor still meant something. They built forts, they trained their troops, and they waited for the inevitable onslaught of the imperial forces. The final battle of the Bushin War was fought at Hakodate, the capital of the fledgling republic. It was a battle that was decided at sea, where the Imperial Navy's new ironclad warship, the Kotetsu, proved to be more than a match for the shogunate's wooden fleet. The forts were bombarded into submission, the troops were routed, and the dream of a samurai republic died in a hail of cannon fire. The great swordsman, Hichikata Toshizo, the demon vice-commander of the Shinzengumi, met his end at Hakodate. He died as he had lived, in the saddle, leading a desperate, hopeless charge against an enemy he knew he could not defeat. He was a relic of a bygone era, a man of the sword in an age of the gun, and his death was a fitting, if tragic, end to his story. Enomoto, ever the pragmatist, surrendered. He and the other leaders of the Republic were taken as prisoners, their grand experiment in samurai governance brought to an ignominious end. The Bushin War was finally, truly over. The last embers of resistance had been stamped out. The age of the samurai was finished. The heroism of these last stands is undeniable. The men of Aizu and Hakodate fought with a courage and a devotion that bordered on the superhuman. They were true to their code, they were loyal to their masters, and they faced their annihilation with a grace and a dignity that is hard not to admire. They were, in the truest sense of the word, samurai. And yet, there is a deep and profound tragedy in their story. Their courage was wasted, their loyalty was misplaced, their sacrifice was, in the grand scheme of things, meaningless. They were fighting for a world that was already dead, for a system that was destined for the dustbin of history. Their last stands were not just noble, they were also profoundly, heartbreakingly futile. This broadcast is a tribute to that noble futility. It is a memorial to the men who chose to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. If you believe that there is a certain glory in a lost cause, if you think that a valiant, if doomed spirit is worth preserving, then do the honorable thing. Like this broadcast, subscribe to this channel. Keep the memory of our fallen brothers alive. Do not let their sacrifice be forgotten. The new government, in its cold and pragmatic wisdom, had no time for such romantic notions. They saw the defenders of Aizu and Hakodate not as heroes, but as traitors, as obstacles to the great project of national unification and modernization. They were a problem to be solved, and they were solved, with overwhelming force. The lesson of these last stands was a harsh one, that in the modern world honor and courage are no match for superior firepower. It was a lesson that the samurai class had been slow to learn, and we had paid a terrible price for our education. The Boshin War was not just a military defeat, it was a philosophical one. It was the brutal refutation of everything we had ever believed in. And what of us, the survivors? We were left to pick up the pieces, to find our way in a world that no longer had any use for us. Some of us, like Enomoto, were able to adapt. We put away our swords, we learned the new ways, we found new ways to serve the nation. We became diplomats, politicians, businessmen. We swallowed our pride and joined the system that had defeated us. But many others could not or would not make that transition. They were the ghosts of the old regime, the men who were haunted by the memory of what they had lost. They lived out their days in poverty and obscurity, their stories untold, their sacrifices unremembered. They were the silent casualties of the new Japan. The story of the last stands is a story that is both inspiring and deeply depressing. It is a story that speaks to the best and the worst of the samurai spirit. It speaks to our capacity for incredible bravery and our fatal inability to adapt to a changing world. It is the story of our glory and of our doom. The symbolism of a samurai charging a line of rifles with a sword is a powerful one. It is an image that has been romanticized in countless plays and stories. It is seen as a symbol of our indomitable spirit, our refusal to surrender. But it is also a symbol of our folly, of our stubborn attachment to a way of war that had become obsolete. It is a symbol of a beautiful and deadly anachronism. And so we are left with the ghosts. The ghosts of the Byakutai on the hillside above Aizu. The ghost of Hijikata Toshizo charging into the guns at Hakodate. The ghosts of countless other samurai who died for a cause that was already lost. They are the ghosts that haunt the new Japan, the silent reminders of the world we destroyed in order to create this new one. This broadcast is for them. It is for the men who fought and died in the last desperate battles of a lost war. It is for the men who chose honor over life, who chose a beautiful death over a compromised existence. Their story is our story. It is the story of the end of an era, and it is a story that deserves to be remembered. The signal is fading, the ghosts are calling, and the silence that follows is the sound of a world that is no more. The war is over. The last of the diehards have been rooted out of their frozen fortress in Hokkaido, and a new era has dawned. They call it the Meiji Restoration. Restoration. A lovely, reassuring word. It suggests a return to something pure, something authentic, the restoration of the emperor to his rightful place, the restoration of our national pride. It is a lie, of course, a beautiful, brilliantly marketed lie. This is not a restoration. This is a demolition a systematic and ruthless tearing down of everything we once were, carried out by the very men we helped to put in power. The new government, a cabal of ambitious samurai from the Western domains, has wasted no time in revealing its true colors. They have a new slogan now, one that has replaced the romantic nonsense of revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The new motto is Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army. It is a cold, pragmatic, and deeply unsettling phrase. It speaks not of honor or tradition, but of wealth and military might. It is the creed of a nation in a hurry, a nation that is willing to sacrifice its soul for a place at the world's table. This first thing to go was the old feudal system. The domains, the han, which had been the building blocks of our society for centuries, were abolished with the stroke of a pen in 1871. They were replaced by prefectures, administrative districts controlled by the central government in Tokyo. The daimyo, the great feudal lords who had once been the masters of their own little kingdoms, were pensioned off, their castles decommissioned, their samurai retainers cast adrift. The personal bond of loyalty that had tied a samurai to his lord, the very bedrock of our existence, was rendered meaningless overnight. Then came the attack on our class itself. They say it's a restoration, feels more like a demolition. My top knot is next, I hear. The shame. The new government, made up of men who were themselves samurai, had come to the rather sensible conclusion that the samurai class was an expensive and inconvenient obstacle to their plans. We were too numerous, we were too proud, and we were too attached to our traditional ways. We were a problem to be solved, and they solved it with a brutal and systematic efficiency. They began by reclassifying us. We were no longer samurai. We were now shizoku, a new and rather meaningless social category that lumped us in with the court nobles. It was a classic bureaucratic trick, an attempt to diminish us by renaming us. Then they came for our income. Our hereditary stipends paid in rice were first reduced, then converted into government bonds that paid a pittance in interest. We, the warrior class, were being forced to learn the humiliating art of living on a budget. The final, inevitable blows came in the mid-1870s. The conscription law of 1873, which created a national army of commoners, made our military skills redundant. And in 1876, the Haishore Edict was issued, banning the wearing of swords in public. The daisho, the twin swords that were the symbol of our status, the soul of our class, the very extension of our being, were now forbidden. To carry a sword was now a criminal offense. It was the ultimate humiliation, a public castration of an entire class of men. The government's obsession with Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, became the new state religion. We were told that our traditional culture was backward, that our customs were barbaric, that our entire way of life was an embarrassment. We were exhorted to adopt the ways of the West, to eat their food, to wear their clothes, to think their thoughts. The old Japan was a source of shame. The new Japan was to be a carbon copy of the West. The speed of the transformation was dizzying, terrifying. One day we were the rulers of the nation, the next we were relics, dinosaurs wandering through a world that had no place for us. We were being told to forget everything we had ever learned, to abandon everything we had ever believed in. We were being asked to commit a form of cultural suicide. The new world they are building is a strange and unsettling place. It is a world of telegraphs and steam trains, of brick buildings and bowler hats. It is a world of contracts and commerce, of parliaments and political parties. It is a world that is obsessed with progress, with efficiency, with the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. It is a world that has no room for poetry, for honor, for the quiet contemplation of a cherry blossom. It is a world without a soul. The irony of it all is that we did this to ourselves. We were the ones who brought down the Shogunate, who fought and died for the restoration of the emperor. We did so out of a misguided sense of patriotism, a naive belief that we could restore the glory of old Japan. Instead, we unleashed a monster, a relentless modernizing force that is now devouring its own creators. We are the victims of our own creators. We are the victims of our own demise. And what of the emperor, the divine being in whose name this revolution is being carried out? He remains a distant and enigmatic figure, a symbol to be trotted out on ceremonial occasions, his face on the new currency. Does he approve of what is being done in his name? Does he weep for the destruction of the old ways, or is he too a prisoner of this new era, a helpless figurehead in a government that is run by ambitious and ruthless men? We will never know. The new leaders of Japan, the men from Satsuma and Choshu who now control the government, are a new breed of samurai. They are pragmatists, they are realists, they are men who have learned the hard lessons of the past few decades. They understand that the world is a dangerous place, that the Western powers are predators, and that the only way to survive is to become a predator yourself. They are building a new Japan that is strong, that is centralized, that is capable of competing with the West on its own terms, and if that means destroying the samurai class, then so be it. We are the price of their progress, the collateral damage of their ambition. We are a sacrifice on the altar of the modern nation-state. It is a bitter and thankless role, but it is the one that history has assigned to us. If you are still processing this dizzying turn of events, if you feel a strange sense of vertigo as the world spins out of control, then you are not alone. This broadcast is a lifeline, a connection to a world that is rapidly disappearing. To hold on, to keep your bearings in this brave and terrifying new world, you must subscribe. It is the only way to ensure that you do not get swept away by the tide of progress. Do it now. Your sanity may depend on it. The psychological impact of these changes on the samurai class was catastrophic. It was a crisis of identity, a collective nervous breakdown. We had been raised to believe that we were special, that we were the moral and spiritual backbone of the nation. Now we were being told that we were nothing more than a parasitic class, a drain on the national economy. The sense of shame, of worthlessness, was overwhelming. Many samurai could not cope. They fell into depression, into alcoholism, into poverty. Some sold off their family heirlooms, their precious swords and armor, just to put food on the table. Others, unable to bear the humiliation, chose the only honorable way out that they knew. They committed seppuku. The number of suicides among the samurai class in the early Meiji years was a silent and tragic testament to the human cost of progress. The new government, of course, had a plan for us. They did not want a large and disgruntled class of unemployed warriors roaming the countryside. They tried to channel our energies into new and productive activities. They encouraged us to become farmers, to go into business, to join the new police force or the civil service. They tried to turn us into ordinary citizens. Some of us made the transition successfully. We adapted, we learned new skills, we found a new sense of purpose in the service of the new Japan. We became the teachers, the bureaucrats, the entrepreneurs who would help to build the modern nation. But we did so at a cost. We had to kill the samurai inside of us, to suppress the instincts and the values that had once defined us. But many others could not or would not make that leap. They were too proud, too attached to the old ways, too deeply invested in the identity that was now being stripped from them. They were the ones who joined the samurai rebellions that plagued the early Meiji government, the ones who made a last, desperate stand for a world that was already gone. They were the ones who died with their swords in their hands, defiant to the last. The Meiji Restoration was not a peaceful transition. It was a violent and traumatic revolution, a cultural earthquake that shattered the foundations of our society. It was a process of creative destruction, one that required the demolition of the old in order to build the new, and we, the samurai, were the primary casualties of that demolition. The new Japan that emerged from the rubble was a strange and contradictory creature. It was a nation that was fiercely proud of its unique cultural heritage, and yet desperately eager to imitate the West. It was a nation that revered its divine emperor, and yet was governed by a ruthlessly pragmatic oligarchy. It was a nation that preached peace and harmony, and yet was building one of the most powerful and aggressive military machines in the world. This new Japan was a source of both wonder and horror to us. We could not help but be impressed by its energy, its ambition, its incredible success in transforming itself from a feudal backwater into a modern industrial power in the space of a single generation. But we also could not help but be appalled by its soullessness, its materialism, its casual disregard for the traditions and the values that we held sacred. We are the ghosts at the feast of Meiji. We are the spectral figures who haunt the background of the official photographs, the silent reminders of the price that was paid for all this progress. We are the last of a dying breed, the final representatives of a world that has been lost to history. The broadcast you are listening to is a message from that lost world. It is a final, fading echo from an age of honor and of gunpowder, of loyalty and of betrayal. It is the story of a class of men who were both the creators and the victims of a revolution, a story of a nation that destroyed itself in order to be reborn. The new dawn has broken, and its light is a harsh and unforgiving one. It illuminates a world that is full of promise, but also full of peril. It is a world that we, the last of the samurai, are no longer equipped to navigate. Our time is over. The future belongs to others. The signal is fading. The silence that follows is the sound of a new and unfamiliar Japan. The static grows louder now, a constant companion in these strange new times. It crackles with the energy of a world being remade, a sound that is slowly drowning out the gentle melodies of the shamisen and the steady, reassuring beat of the taiko drum. The air itself feels different, heavy with the hum of unseen machines and the scent of progress, which, I have discovered, smells remarkably like coal smoke and rust. It is the sound of an ending, and, I suppose, a beginning, though for men like me, the distinction has become rather blurry. We have traveled a long and bloody road together, you and I, from the first arrogant arrival of the black ships, a floating insult to our national pride, to the bitter and confusing civil war that pitted brother against brother. We have witnessed the fall of a shogunate that stood for 2.5 centuries, and the rise of an emperor who, until recently, was little more than a divine florist. It has been a bewildering, terrifying, and often darkly comical journey. We have seen our world dismantled piece by painful piece and replaced with something new, something foreign, something efficient. They have taken our swords, they have taken our stipends, and now they are coming for our hair. The topknot, the chonmage, the proud symbol of the samurai, is now deemed unfashionable, a relic of a barbaric past. We are encouraged with the full weight of the new government's disapproval to adopt the hairstyles of the West. Soon we will all look like well-groomed poodles. The shame of it all is a constant nagging presence, a final petty humiliation in a long line of them. And yet we endure, we, the last of the samurai, we ghosts of a forgotten age. We walk the streets of this new Tokyo, a city we no longer recognize, and we watch as the new Japan rises around us. We are anachronisms, living museum pieces, but we are also witnesses. We are the memory of a world that has been sacrificed on the altar of progress. And as long as one of us still draws breath, that world will not be entirely forgotten. Our swords may be gone, but our stories remain. And so, as the sun rises on a Japan that no longer recognizes itself, this has been Master Kenji, your humble and increasingly anachronistic broadcaster from the final days of the Shogunate. We saw honor challenged, felt the sting of gunfire, and witnessed the Emperor's return, and what a busy return it's been. They say the new government is building a nation. It feels more like they are conducting a very loud, very extensive, and very poorly planned demolition of my house. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the brink of a new era has given you a moment of grim contemplation, or perhaps made you appreciate your own world's stable plumbing and lack of mandatory top-knot removal, then my purpose is served. This broadcast was never about changing the course of history, it was about bearing witness to it. It was about capturing the echoes of a dying tradition before they faded into the static of the new age. If these echoes have resonated with you, if the story of our struggle has moved you in some small way, then I have one final request. Keep listening, keep questioning, and for the sake of the Bushido, keep that subscribe button pressed. Because, even when tradition gives way to gunpowder, the spirit of inquiry remains. It is the only weapon they cannot take from us. Your subscription is more than just a click. It is an act of remembrance. It is a promise that our story, the story of the last samurai, will not be lost. Until the next broadcast, if I can figure out how this infernal device works with all these newfangled telegraph wires. They hum with a power I do not understand, a language I cannot speak. Perhaps the future is not for me to comprehend, but only to observe. The static is winning now. The sounds of the whirring machines are louder than the beating of my own heart. The new Japan is calling, and I must take my leave. Sayonara, goodbye.